Every day we hear about new cases of violence, and the statistics are simply shocking. Every 2 hours, somewhere in the world, a woman dies at the hands of a man. This problem affects each and every one of us, regardless of age, gender, or social status. The story we will discuss in this episode is a stark example of how the pursuit of quick money and ill-considered decisions can lead to fatal consequences. A young Italian woman found herself trapped after being tempted by easy cash. She had no idea that her life was about to be shattered and that she would become the victim of a horrific crime. Our story's heroine, Carol Maltesi, was born in 1995 to a mixed Italian-Dutch family. Her mother, Giuseppina, was from Italy, while her father, Fabio, was from the Netherlands. Unfortunately, when Carol was still very young, her parents decided to divorce. Fabio moved back to his native country, while Giuseppina stayed in Italy to raise her daughter alone. It was a difficult challenge for the woman, as she had to work a lot, often far from home, to provide for her family. But despite all the hardships, Carol did not hold a grudge against her mother, understanding that she was doing everything possible for her sake. Carol grew up in the small provincial town of Sesto Calenda. From an early age, she displayed traits such as determination, decisiveness, and cheerfulness. Carol was a very active child. She took dance classes, loved horseback riding, and dreamed of traveling. In addition, she had a knack for learning languages and knew several foreign ones at a young age. But the girl's greatest passion was books. She could spend hours immersed in the world of literature. Despite all her talents and hobbies, Carol sometimes suffered from excessive boastfulness. But thanks to her openness, sincerity, and optimism, she easily made friends and attracted the attention of those around her. In 2015, the young Italian woman entered a technical university. It was during this period that her life underwent dramatic changes. She fell in love and became pregnant by her boyfriend. Despite her young age of 20, Carol decided to have the child, even though the pregnancy was unplanned. She sincerely believed that she would be able to cope with her new role as a mother. However, reality turned out to be much more complicated than expected. After giving birth to her baby in 2016, the young mother faced numerous difficulties. The child's father was also not yet financially stable, but despite all the hardships, the young couple was determined to cope with the challenges of family life. In an attempt to improve their situation, Carol, her boyfriend, and their young son moved to Verona, a larger city where they managed to find work. During this period, Carol got a job as a sales consultant in a shoe store. It seemed that life was gradually improving, and the young family, although not without difficulties, was coping with all the troubles. But already in 2019, another twist occurred in Carol's fate. She unexpectedly fell in love with another man, and, for several months, led a double life until the truth was revealed. Her betrayed boyfriend, the father of her child, decided to end the relationship, and Carol herself, who had long dreamed of change, supported this decision. Carol sought to start a new life with her beloved, who was living with his parents at the time, so she decided to temporarily leave her son with his father to give herself time to adapt and find ways to ease their fate. In addition to her personal problems, during this period, Carol's mother was suffering from a neurodegenerative disease that was rapidly progressing. Carol tried to spend as much time with her as possible, but already in February 2020, the world was shaken by a pandemic that hit European countries particularly hard. Italians, including Carol, found themselves in a very difficult situation. The lockdown made it impossible to work, move freely, and live a normal life. Due to the forced isolation, Carol faced serious financial difficulties. She could not even send money for her son's upkeep. This situation pushed the young woman to search for new ways to earn money. At first, she tried to launch a YouTube channel where she would share her experience of surviving under severe restrictions. Carol hoped to make money from advertising, but she quickly realized that it was a long and unrewarding path that was unlikely to bring her significant funds. Then Carol turned her attention to the OnlyFans platform, which seemed much more promising. Under the pseudonym Charlotte Engel, she began experimenting with creating explicit photo and video content. The first attempts brought in decent money, so Carol continued this activity, gradually moving towards increasingly daring material. In fact, Carol enjoyed what she was doing on the OnlyFans platform. However, this industry also had a flip side. When the girl's entourage learned about her new activity, many friends decided to break off relations with her. Carol herself considered such behavior unfair and called it nothing but prejudice. She sincerely believed that the world of explicit content was a kind of art form, and that Italy was simply lagging behind other countries in terms of progressive thinking. For Carol, it was obvious that most people visit such sites and view photos and videos of a spicy nature anyway, so she saw nothing wrong with her job. Gradually, Carol gained considerable popularity on OnlyFans, and she began to be invited to shoot adult films. Carol agreed to such offers without any hesitation and even participated in relevant performances. In interviews, Carol explained that she did not plan to devote her entire life to this. She already had certain projects for the future, but for now she was enjoying what she was doing and saving money to make her dream come true. At the same time, Carol began to publish posts on social media filled with indignation. The judgmental attitude of others towards her new job forced her to talk about the psychological pressure and constant moral condemnation she faced because of her activity. Carol defended women's right to freely choose their field of employment. Despite understanding that her work was unconventional for most people, Carol felt that she was being undeservedly humiliated for her choice. But public condemnation was not the only problem the woman faced. Her new boyfriend, for whom she had divorced her child's father, also had a negative attitude towards her passion. The situation escalated, and eventually the couple decided to part ways. At the age of 25, Carol found herself at a crossroads again and moved to the small town of Riscaldino, a suburb of Milan with a population of about 15,000 inhabitants. Here she tried to break with her dubious activity and got a job in a perfume store. But soon Carol returned to filming and quit her new job. It was in Riscaldino that fate brought Carol together with 42-year-old Davide Fontana, a banker and a rather well-known personality. The man actively ran his own culinary pages on social media, where he shared his knowledge about the history of haute cuisine and demonstrated his own achievements in this field. In addition, David was passionate about high-tech and photography, not traditional photography, but explicit photo shoots. As it turned out, Fontana had been married for many years and had a stable, loving relationship with his wife. But with the help of the internet, he realized another passion. He was looking for attractive girls who were willing to participate in spicy photo shoots. That's how he met Carol in November 2020. The man was enchanted by this girl, and soon a relationship developed between them. Despite the fact that Davide was married, he offered Carol sex for money, and she agreed. After some time in such a relationship, the banker realized that he had developed real feelings for his mistress. In March 2021, he confessed his infidelity to his wife and insisted on a divorce, exchanging a stable relationship for a fleeting affair with a young girl. At the same time, David deceived his wife by telling her that his new passion was named Deborah. Apparently, he was afraid that his wife would want to find Carol and take revenge on the family wrecker. One way or another, the couple began to live together, and their relationship became truly close. Davide helped Carol with the filming of explicit photos and videos, receiving a portion of her earnings in return. Carol turned into a celebrity in this industry and began to receive contracts from other countries. Her boyfriend knew that she was filming adult movies where she had sex with other men and participated in public performances. However, he seemed not to be bothered by this. But in reality, David was quite a jealous man, although this did not extend to Carol's work. Sometime after the beginning of their relationship, Carol's ex-boyfriend approached her and suggested renewing their connection. When Fontana found out about this, he became enraged. He was afraid that the young beauty would leave him for a guy her age, so he decided to take action. The man repeatedly called his rival and threatened him, even though Carol herself had refused her ex. David's jealousy reached its peak when he began to threaten Carol's ex-boyfriend, who tried to rekindle their relationship. Unknown individuals punctured the tires on the rival's car twice, and although Fontana's involvement could not be proven, his threats made him the prime suspect. Meanwhile, Carol's popularity on social media was growing rapidly. She already had over 30,000 followers on her pages. Carol traveled a lot, filming content in the Czech Republic and the Netherlands. In addition, she fulfilled individual orders received in private messages. For a considerable amount of money, Carol brought to life in front of the camera scenarios sent by clients. In the fall of 2021, a new man appeared in the heroine's life, a colleague from adult films, Salvatore Galda. Real feelings flared up between them, and soon Salvatore gave Carol an engagement ring and later proposed to her. Carol agreed to marry him, but now the question arose of how to get rid of Davide. Life with the banker had become unbearable for Carol. She no longer loved him, dreaming of another man with whom she was secretly meeting. At the same time, Fontana continued to take part in her activities, taking a percentage from each video he helped with. The business was thriving, bringing the girl considerable wealth. She had earned enough to afford not to work. In Carol's immediate plans was a return to Verona to be closer to her son. She continued to perform live at private parties and special events related to the adult industry. But at the beginning of 2022, the woman suddenly disappeared from the radar, ceasing all activity. Only occasionally did she respond in writing to messages from friends and family. Posts on social media also became infrequent. It seemed that the once active Carol had lost interest in her projects. Loved ones began to worry as this situation lasted for about 2 months. Carol did not talk to anyone on the phone and did not answer calls. To all questions, she replied that she was busy with household chores, looking for housing in Verona, and establishing a relationship with her child. Later, Carol reported that she was going on vacation to Dubai. Carol's worried friends contacted David, but he admitted that their relationship had ended and he had no idea where to look for the missing woman. This whole situation looked extremely suspicious, and soon it became clear why. On March 20th, 2022, a man who was walking along the picturesque cliffs in the village of Borno noticed strange large black garbage bags from the height of the ledge on the shore. They seemed half empty, but heavy, as if filled with stones. Intrigued, the local resident descended to the mysterious objects, which felt unusual to the touch. Upon untying the first bag he came across, the man found a human hand inside and immediately called the police. The carabinieri, who arrived at the top of the slope, immediately noticed that the bags had been thrown from the cliff. Because of this, they had been torn on the rocks, which could have damaged the contents. A total of 4 bags were found with 18 parts of a mutilated body. From the very beginning, it became obvious that the remains had been deliberately disfigured to make identification difficult. The victim's face was so distorted that it was impossible to recognize her without additional laboratory analysis. The flesh had been cut from some body parts as if on purpose. As for the condition of the remains, the killer was apparently a hunter or a butcher. He skillfully dismembered the body, acting professionally and precisely, knowing where and how to cut. Before throwing the bags down the slope, the parts had been stored in the cold for a long time. Forensic experts suggested that they had simply been dumped from a freezer right off the ledge shortly before a passerby stumbled upon the terrible find. Given the thorough approach and professionalism of the criminal, the police suspected that they were dealing with a serial killer. One of the investigators recalled a similar case in March 2005 when as many as 10 bags with the remains of 2 people were found nearby. The killer was caught then and put behind bars, but the handwriting was too similar, which led to the chilling thought that a maniac was on the loose. To get closer to solving the crime, it was necessary to establish the identity of the victim and find evidence. But the body was so mutilated that it was impossible to even determine the gender without additional analysis. A thorough examination in the laboratory was due. Meanwhile, a press conference was held, necessary to warn local residents. At that time, the Carabinieri still did not know who the victim was. The gender had not yet been determined, but people were warned, and important witnesses who might have noticed something were sought. The cause of death also remained unknown. During this period, forensic experts worked actively to provide answers to all these questions and delve into the gruesome details of the last minutes of the unidentified victim's life. Soon, they found out that they were dealing with a young woman about 155 centimeters tall with dark hair. Her nails were covered with purple nail polish, and several tattoos were found on her skin, 11 in total. But most of them turned out to be deliberately damaged by the killer. It seemed that attempts had been made to erase them, cut them off, or tear them off along with the skin. Apparently, the criminal wanted to hide all traces that would help identify the victim, thereby complicating the investigation. The tattoos became an important clue for the investigators. Despite the fact that the authorities did not yet know the name of the deceased, the public was already informed that the victim was a woman. The police released a description of some of the surviving tattoos in the hope that someone would recognize their owner. But people remained silent. A forensic examination established that the death had occurred more than a month ago, and before the body was thrown from the cliff, it had been stored in a freezer for a long time. This information caught the attention of journalist Andrea Torelli, who was also the editor of a magazine. The man became fascinated with the mysterious murder and began to analyze all the available information. Based on the data collected, Andrea made a logical assumption. Firstly, the criminal was unlikely to want to transport the remains to such a remote provincial area. Most likely, he lived relatively close to where the body was found. Secondly, the journalist was convinced that the killer was familiar with his victim, which meant that she herself must have lived nearby. Of course, these were only guesses, but it was from them that Torelli began his investigation. A pertinent question arose in the reporter's mind. Why had there been no reports of a missing person who fit the description of the girl found? After all, more than a month had passed since her death. How did it happen that her relatives did not notice her absence and did not search for her? A breakthrough in the investigation occurred a week after the body was discovered, on March 26, 2022. A random witness contacted the police, claiming that he recognized the dead girl from Borno. He managed to identify her precisely thanks to the tattoos he had previously seen when Carol gave an interview under the pseudonym Charlotte. It turned out that the victim was an actress in adult films and actively maintained pages on social media. After comparing Charlotte's photos with her tattoos, the Carabinieri were convinced that it was indeed her. To obtain useful clues, the police released the deceased's pseudonym. Andrea Torelli continued his own investigation, delving into the details of the murdered woman's life. He found out that Carol had collaborated with 2 agencies at once. At the first film studio, they replied that she had not worked with them for a long time, did not answer calls or messages, so the management decided that she had simply left the business, as sometimes happens. They could not tell anything more interesting. At the second film studio, the journalist spoke with another actress from adult films who called herself a friend of the deceased. She provided the phone number used by Charlotte. Thanks to this data, it was finally possible to find out the victim's real name, Carol Maltesi. Andrea Torelli tried to call the girl's cell phone number several times, but to no avail. Then he tried to contact her through a messenger. And, surprisingly, someone allegedly answered the text message, claiming to be Carol herself. The journalist, under the pretext of an interview about the life of an actress in this industry, tried to arrange a meeting with her. However, he received a rude refusal in response. Andrea understood that it was not actually Carol responding, but the likely killer. The reporter was persistent and tried to continue the dialogue, persuading the so-called Carol to record a voice message or talk on the phone. Having received another refusal, Torelli changed his tactics. He reported that the body of a girl with identical tattoos, like in Carol Maltesi's photos, had recently been found. Therefore, he would like to talk and make sure that the actress was alive. the criminal probably did not know about the discovery of the body, and this news came as a real shock to him. Apparently, he was counting on the remains not being found for a long time and then not being able to be identified. Fortunately, he was mistaken. The journalist continued the conversation, insisting on at least a 3-second conversation. But after that, the interlocutor simply disappeared. He stopped responding and reading messages. The reporter was convinced that he had just communicated with Carol's killer. He had 2 options for action. First, he could publish this information in his magazine. The news would become a sensation and make him famous. Second, he could turn to the police so that detectives could verify the information themselves. But then he risked the possibility of a leak of information that other media would publish. Moreover, the journalist understood that his intervention could end badly. After all, now the killer was aware that he was being sought, and therefore could try to flee to another country, hide somewhere in Italy, or resort to radical measures, take his own life. Despite all the risks and potential harm he could cause to the investigation, Andrea could also move it forward, and he did the right thing by first contacting the police. On the 27th, Torelli went to the police station and handed over the collected information to the Carabinieri. And only after that did he write an article in his magazine. But he did not provide all the details, indicate the victim's real name, or mention his communication with the killer. However, even such an article had the effect of a bomb exploding. After talking with Andrea, the criminal was already on guard. He began to monitor the news, so he quickly realized that the investigation was progressing and approaching him. Gripped by panic, he decided to report the girl's disappearance to the police, apparently to deflect suspicion from himself. On the day the article was published, Davide Fontana and Carol's fiancé named Salvatore came to the police station together. They filed a missing person report for the girl. They were immediately invited into an office for questioning, which lasted until 4 o'clock the next morning. On March 28th, official publications from other media appeared in newspapers stating that DNA examination had confirmed the identity of the deceased. It was Carol Maltese. And the very next day, March 29th at 7:15 a.m., the Carabinieri again appealed to the public through the mass media. They reported that a 43-year-old man had been detained on suspicion of premeditated murder with aggravating circumstances. It turned out to be Davide Fontana, who had been nervous and confused in his testimony from the very beginning of the interrogation. At first, he claimed that he had not seen the girl for 2 years, but this, of course, was not true. In addition, it did not explain why the man decided to report the disappearance just a few days after her body was found. The investigators quickly managed to break the main suspect. Under pressure, Davide began to talk. According to him, on January 11th, he and Carol were filming a video commissioned by one of the fans of her work. The man admitted that it was a much more extreme recording than the ones the couple had made before. The customer asked to put a bag over Carol's head, tie her up, tape her mouth shut, and also beat her and hit her on the head with a hammer several times in the process. According to the script, Davide was supposed to torture the actress, and she voluntarily agreed to this. So the man started the actions on record. He dealt several blows to the head with a hammer and also beat the tied-up girl for a long time. When it was finally over and David removed the bag, it turned out that Carol was dying. She was still twitching in her death throes, so the killer, according to him, was worried that Carol was continuing to suffer. Allegedly wanting to relieve her from suffering, he took a kitchen knife and cut her throat out of mercy. From the suspect's confessions, it became known that instead of calling the police or an ambulance when Carol was dying, he first finished off his victim and then began to plan how to get rid of the body. For 3 months after the murder, he dismembered Carol's remains and stored them in a freezer. At the same time, the man used the murdered woman's cell phone, communicating with her relatives and friends through social networks and messengers. In this way, he maintained contact and created the illusion that Carol was alive. The criminal's testimony was confused and fragmentary. He often got confused and changed some details of the story. His entire story looked doubtful, and everything required careful verification. In the end, the detectives managed to recreate an approximate picture of what had happened. As it turned out, Carol really wanted to move to Verona to be closer to her son. Here, Carol planned to gradually end her career in the dubious industry. She no longer wished to take part in it and strove to become an ordinary person. Carol intended to marry her boyfriend Salvatore. On January 8, 2022, she performed at the club for the last time, and on the 11th, she was going to shoot a commissioned video with Davide for the last time. The investigation established that the order came from a fake account created by the banker himself. In it, he described in detail the perverse video that Carol was supposed to shoot. The scene included tying up, taping the mouth shut, a bag over the head, beating, and a blow to the head with a hammer. During the process, the man was supposed to find out the password to the girl's cell phone from her. This was part of a script conceived as the highest manifestation of domination over a person. Carol agreed, not even suspecting that by doing so, she was giving her executioner the opportunity to kill her. Initially, they agreed that he would imitate all actions, without using force, and Carol would pretend to be suffering in order to avoid real injuries. Instead, Davide acted at full force, getting carried away and crossing all boundaries. Obviously, all this was planned in advance, so the crime clearly had an intentional character. As soon as Davide found out the password to Carol's phone, he deviated from the script and began to brutally beat the girl until he beat her to death with a hammer. For several days, the killer came to the filming location and looked at the lifeless actress, satisfying his sadistic needs. After that, the man went to a hardware store, where he bought a hacksaw, large scissors, an electric saw, and spare blades. The banker also ordered a large freezer and a brazier, using Carol's phone to do so. It was the brazier that caused the severe burns that the police found on her body. On January 14th, Carol was supposed to go to Paris with her boyfriend Salvatore, but Davide told him that Carol had contracted COVID and was self-isolating. The fiancé believed it, because many people in their circle were sick. He unsuccessfully tried to contact Carol under various pretexts, but Davide refused each time, referring to her poor health. The story of Carol Maltese's murder shook all of Italy. Davide Fontana, a banker and a celebrity in the culinary world, was arrested on March 29, 2022, on suspicion of premeditated murder with aggravating circumstances. It was he, as it turned out, who was the main person involved in this horrific case. Strangely, for 2 months, none of the girl's relatives or loved ones tried to get into Davide's dwelling to find out what had actually happened to Carol. This played into the hands of the killer, who calmly dismembered the body and hid traces of the crime, staging the illusion of his victim's life. According to him, Carol's phone did not stop ringing. Every day, someone from friends or relatives wrote a message or called. Occasionally, Davide even updated the girl's pages on social networks with pictures from her personal gallery. From her bank card, he made noticeable purchases and even paid for housing rent to maintain the legend that Carol was living a secluded life because she was being treated. After the interrogation was over, Fontana stated that he had tried to commit suicide by writing a statement about Carol's disappearance, but he could not do it because he was arrested. However, no one believed this, because for 3 months, while the man was enjoying the crime he had committed and hiding its traces, he had enough time for suicide. Court hearings in the Carol Maltese case began on November 24, 2022. The lawyer insisted on the version of unintentional murder. They say Davide got carried away with fulfilling the client's order and accidentally killed his beloved girl. But prosecutors convincingly proved that it was he who created the fake request for this cruel video, which means that the massacre was planned in advance. The password to the victim's phone also became known to the criminal not by chance. He wanted to buy time by responding on behalf of Carol and deceiving her loved ones in order to have time to get rid of the body. The prosecution believed that the motive for the crime could be jealousy or greed. Carol's relationship with Salvatore was developing rapidly. The couple was planning a wedding, and Carol was going to move out from Davide. For him, this meant the loss not only of a mistress, but also of the income he received from their joint filming. However, considering Carol's main occupation, regular sex with different men in front of the camera for money, the version about jealousy did not look too plausible. Davide never showed jealousy about the girl's work at several studios at the same time, but as soon as she decided to end her career and start a family with another man, he immediately killed her. A psychiatric examination showed that the accused was sane and fully aware of his actions. The verdict in this high-profile case was announced on June 12, 2023. Although the prosecution demanded life imprisonment, the judge decided that the killer's actions were not intentional in nature. Even the fact that the body was dismembered was not taken into account as an aggravating circumstance. As a result, Davide Fontana received a surprisingly lenient sentence, only 30 years in prison. In addition, he was obliged to pay compensation to the victim's 7-year-old son in the amount of 180,000 euros. He had to pay Carol's parents a total of another 100,000, and the father of her child 20,000 euros in compensation. Such a court decision shocked the Maltese family. Davide's involvement in similar murders in the past could not be proven. Journalist Andrea Torelli, who took an active part in this case, wrote a book about the course of the investigation. In it, he told in detail how his intervention helped expose one of the cruelest murderers in the history of Italy. Dear friends, here we have come to the end of this sad and instructive story. The tragic fate of Carol Maltese makes us think about many things: difficult life choices, the price of quick earnings, the importance of valuing one's own life and safety. Every person has the right to choose their own path, and we cannot condemn Carol for her decision to become an actress in adult films. But at the same time, we must understand that any profession has its risks. Just as a policeman is exposed to the danger of being killed by a criminal every day, work in the adult entertainment industry, unfortunately, can also be extremely dangerous. Carol's story is a bitter lesson for all of us. It teaches us that we should not make important life decisions hastily, guided only by the desire to make money quickly. Sometimes what seems like easy money can turn into a terrible tragedy. Before taking a serious step, it is worth stopping and thinking not twice but 3 times, to weigh all the pros and cons, to assess the possible risks and consequences. Of course, each of us dreams of financial stability and prosperity. But are money worth risking one's health, safety, and sometimes even life for? Isn't it better to earn less, but be able to enjoy every day lived, to feel protected and needed by one's loved ones? Let us be wiser and more prudent. Let us not allow greed and the desire for easy gain to cloud our minds. Let us not be afraid of hard and honest work. Let our path to success be longer but safer. Let us value every moment spent with family and loved ones, because no money can bring back a lost life. Justice in this world can sometimes be cruel and relentless. Davide Fontana, Carol's killer, received only 30 years in prison, too lenient a punishment for such a terrible crime. But can any term behind bars return a mother to a little son or a daughter to her parents? If only it were possible to turn back time and convince Carol not to take that fatal step. But what happened, happened. Now we can only learn important lessons from this tragedy and live on, not repeating others' mistakes. Let Carol's death be a reminder to each of us. Life is priceless and fragile, so cherish it and do not subject it to unjustified risk. In conclusion, I want to address all of you, dear viewers. Thank you for being here throughout this difficult story. I know that sometimes it was painful and scary for you, but you found the strength to listen to Carol's story to the end. I hope it did not leave you indifferent and prompted you to take a fresh look at some things. Many people make mistakes when they fall in love. Sometimes these mistakes push a partner away. A similar situation happened in the life of the heroine of this story. But in this case, everything went too far and cost a person their life. This is not just a story about a brutal crime. This is a warning about the danger that can await any woman when she least expects it. Get comfortable. You're on the DBS channel. My name is John. Let's go. Savannah Anderson was born on December 6, 1956 in St. Louis County, Minnesota, USA, the only child in the family. The girl's parents took great care of her, and a strong bond formed between them that lasted for years. In childhood, Savannah was no different from others, balanced, quick-witted, prudent, kind, and fair. Cruelty was alien to her. But despite the apparent idyll, when Savannah was a schoolgirl, her parents divorced. The girl stayed with her mother and they moved to Salt Lake City, Utah. At the age of 22, the heroine decided to change her place of residence again and moved to the city of Irvine, California. This move underscored her extraordinary independence. Striving for career success, Savannah simply packed her things, rented an apartment in a new city, and immediately got a job as a secretary at a bank while studying to build a career in her chosen direction. From the very beginning, Savannah established herself as a diligent employee and found many new friends. She was bright, attractive, and full of energy, although she did not like excessive attention, was quite secretive, and did not share the details of her life with outsiders. About 3 months after the move, a guy named Bill Mills appeared on her path. The relationship between them was very strong from the beginning, and Savannah repeatedly confessed to her relatives about her sincere feelings. Her boyfriend had serious intentions. They often discussed marriage, family, and children. But before that, they both wanted to stand firmly on their feet, get an education and high positions at work, and acquire their own housing. Both lovers worked in the banking sector, which brought them even closer together. Around 6:00 p.m. on May 14, 1979, Bill came to his girlfriend's residential complex, hoping to meet with her. At that time, Savannah had been renting an apartment in the Woodbridge Apartments for a month and a half. Knocking on the door and not getting an answer, the guy was not very worried, assuming that his beloved was delayed at work, busy with things, or went out somewhere for a short while. Therefore, he decided to return to his place and wait for a call. In those days, there was no mobile communication, so in order not to miss a call from Savannah, Bill had to stay by the home phone. Over the next hour and a half, he called the girl every 10 to 15 minutes so as not to miss the moment of her return. Anxiety grew because she was always punctual and responsible, and the call never came. The lovers had agreed to meet in advance, so this situation seemed strange. The unsuccessful attempts to get through lasted until 7:30 p.m., when Bill, already very alarmed, decided to contact the 911 emergency service with a request to check on the girl's condition. He knew that Savannah had been unwell in recent days, so he began to worry that her inability to answer the call or open the door might be related to a deterioration in her well-being. When the police arrived on the call, not only Bill was waiting at the apartment, but also Ken Bergensen, Savannah's boss, who also decided to visit her. He appeared at the address immediately after the end of the work shift, a few minutes before the law enforcement officers. Savannah was supposed to go to work on May 14th, but she never showed up. This caused concern among colleagues. Everyone was puzzled by the atypical behavior of the usually responsible girl and the inability to contact her. Employees and the manager tried to call Savannah during the day, but to no avail. No one was able to find out what happened and get any information. Such behavior was extremely uncharacteristic for her. Savannah not only never missed work shifts, but also always warned if she was going to be late or encountered any difficulties. That is why Ken Bergensen personally visited her home to make sure that Savannah was all right. It was already dark outside. The law enforcement officers tried in vain to see anything suspicious in the windows, illuminating them with flashlights. Knocking on the door also remained unanswered. Luckily, the officers noticed that one of the windows was unlocked. The policeman managed to get inside through it and open the doors for his colleagues from the inside. Getting into the bedroom, they found themselves in the middle of a chilling scene. Everything around was covered in blood, splashes on the walls and ceiling, bedding soaked through. And in the midst of this chaos, on the bed lay Savannah's bloodied body, lifeless. Her face was hidden by a towel thrown over it, under which bruises and a mutilated head were visible. Despite obvious traces of a brutal attack, the girl was recognized immediately. Everything indicated that before the murder, 22-year-old Savannah was brutally beaten. The police immediately noted that the towel on her face was a valuable clue. The attacker was probably well acquainted with the victim or had warm feelings for her and wanted to depersonalize her identity by covering her face. Perhaps it was an attempt to hide from himself the terrible consequences of what he had done. This is how murderers often act, who, in their distorted minds, try to calm the victim, ease her suffering, and distance themselves from reality. Another strange detail that caught the attention of investigators was the large number of jewelry on the body of the deceased. There was a pendant on her neck with a fastener in the front, not in the back, as usual. Several bracelets on the wrists, a watch, and numerous rings. Experienced detectives suggested that all these accessories were put on the girl after the murder, in a hurry, although the reasons for such an act remained unclear. The next interesting fact is that the body was probably washed after the attack. The traces of dragging left by blood hinted that Savannah was moved around the apartment. Bloody prints were found in the bathroom and sink. Similar stains were scattered throughout the home. But Savannah herself looked too clean for a person who had suffered numerous injuries with a blunt object and a prolonged beating. All the evidence found indicated that the criminal was obsessed with Savannah. The absence of signs of breaking in indicated that Savannah let the killer in herself, or he got in through the window. At first glance, nothing valuable was missing. On the contrary, the jewelry remained on the body, so the version of robbery was rejected. Signs of rape were revealed, but everything required more thorough verification. Given the technical limitations of forensics in 1979, the main attention of the police focused on the search for fingerprints, palm prints, and biological substances. A palm print was found on the wall in the apartment, and a fingerprint on the inside of the toilet lid. However, the killer's hands were so heavily stained with blood that only very blurry fragments were obtained, unsuitable at that time for full use due to the low quality. The victim had clearly tried to defend herself, as evidenced by the numerous characteristic injuries all over her body. Savannah suffered strangulation, but continued to fight the attacker, leaving traces of her own nails on her neck, obviously trying to push his hands away. Against the background of the raging violence, there was no doubt that the criminal came to this apartment with a clear intention to kill. The assumptions that he was familiar with his victim were also confirmed. According to the forensic expert, the death of our story's heroine occurred around 2 o'clock in the morning on May 14th from strangulation, probably with bare hands, as indicated by the characteristic injuries and areas of torn skin that Savannah inflicted on herself in desperation, trying to save her life. In addition, she received several serious blows to the head with a blunt object, had a broken jaw, knocked out fingers and teeth. And to top it all off, the victim was also brutally raped. In view of all the circumstances, the police decided to first talk to Bill, the victim's boyfriend. Since the previous evening, he could have been the last person to see her alive. In such crimes, the closest person is often involved. But Bill was described as a good-natured and calm guy, not prone to aggression, and there were never any problems or conflicts in the couple's relationship. As Bill himself said, at the time of the murder, they had been dating for only about 3 months, starting back when she still lived in her old apartment and continuing after her move to the new home. Savannah had been living here for about a month and a half and had barely had time to get to know her closest neighbors. Bill last saw his girlfriend the night before, on May 13th. They spent time together, relaxed, after which around 10 o'clock in the evening he left. They both needed to get up early for work, and at 6 o'clock the next day they agreed to meet again. But Savannah never got in touch again. All this time, Bill behaved like a loving boyfriend, devastated by the loss. The detectives had no doubt that his feelings were sincere and his desire to cooperate with the investigation from the very beginning. The only suspicious thing was Bill's refusal to take a polygraph test, although he explained this by his lawyer's advice and the low accuracy of the technique. Despite this, the police had almost no doubt that Bill was not involved. At the very least, Savannah actively resisted the attacker, considering the many injuries he received. The absence of wounds on her boyfriend convinced the detectives of his innocence. Bill was released for the period of examination of the collected palm and fingerprints, which at that time took much longer than now. The tests were expected to take several weeks. The next person who attracted the attention of the detectives was Savannah's immediate supervisor, Ken Bergenson. During the interrogation, Ken admitted that he had met the girl not so long ago, namely after she got a job at the bank. According to Ken, they had a warm, friendly relationship. He treated Savannah almost paternally, even helping her move to a new apartment. From time to time, they casually chatted over a cup of tea at work. But as Ken assured, this friendship never went beyond the established boundaries. Ken was married, and his wife confirmed her husband's words. In addition, he also had no characteristic injuries that would indicate self-defense on the part of the victim. Ken's palm and fingerprints were taken just in case and sent for examination, after which he was released. In fact, this is where the list of suspects ended. Savannah had no bad habits and did not make acquaintances with dubious individuals, so the search for the criminal reached a dead end. The detectives decided to talk to the girl's neighbors and the employees of the residential complex. Among the latter, 2 security guards stood out who could have noticed something suspicious. The first of them was Chuck Duell, who on the night of the murder took the shift in the evening and worked until 6:30 in the morning. Right at the beginning of the interrogation, he told the police that he hardly knew the deceased, they just greeted each other when they met. Chuck had only dealt with Savannah once in everyday life. When she forgot her keys and couldn't get into her apartment, the security guard climbed into the home through the window and let the girl in. Chuck immediately emphasized that if his fingerprints were found on the window, it was related to this very incident that happened about a week before the tragedy. This statement immediately seemed suspicious, as if the guard was trying to make excuses in advance. Then, Chuck gave a detailed report of his working night. After taking over the shift, he first made his rounds around the residential complex and then dozed off in the company vehicle. But around 1:30 a.m., Chuck was awakened by his shift mate Robert Sellers, nicknamed Bob, who suddenly, without permission, got into his car. Completely spontaneously, Bob suggested going to grab a bite to eat at the nearest restaurant, located just a 10-minute drive from their residential complex. And although Chuck had to constantly be at his post, he agreed to keep his colleague company. The guards returned only after 2 hours. Having received this information, the police decided to clarify the details with Bob Sellers himself. It turned out that Robert was a Marine, and at the time of the events was serving at the local base. In parallel, he got a job as a security guard in the residential complex, where he worked in shifts, trying in this way to combine 2 jobs and save money. According to Bob, he last saw Savannah around 10 o'clock in the evening on May 13th in the window when she was talking on the phone. The man himself was just leaving work at that moment, and Savannah was standing by the window. The police checked this information and found out that Savannah had indeed last talked on the phone with her mother at about the same time that Bob indicated. The guard did not lie and helped establish the time frame. As Robert explained, after the shift, he could not fall asleep in any way, although the next morning he had to get up again for service. Therefore, around 3 o'clock in the morning, the man returned to his partner Chuck and suggested going to get something to eat. In general, the stories of the guards coincided, with the exception of one point. According to Bob, he arrived at the residential complex around 3 in the morning and immediately suggested that Chuck go eat, and Chuck claimed that his partner woke him up around 1:30. Perhaps it was an ordinary slip of the tongue, or one of the men simply got confused with the time. But the detectives decided to conduct a simultaneous interrogation of both guards in order to finally clarify the timeline of events. Hearing his partner's story, Chuck became confused and suddenly admitted that he did not remember the exact time well, since he had dozed off. Now he was more inclined to Bob's version. In the end, both men, guessing the suspicions of the police, stated that they had an alibi. At the restaurant where they went, their friend, a waitress named Gail, worked. Savannah had to confirm the guard's visit and approximate time. That's what Gail did, although she admitted that she couldn't say for sure what time the men arrived. At that moment, the waitress was terribly tired and could barely stay on her feet. However, this was enough to clear the suspicion from the guards. When the examination of fingerprints and palm prints was finally completed, it became clear that neither the victim's boyfriend nor her boss left bloody traces at the crime scene. The investigation was at an impasse. Due to the lack of obvious suspects, the detectives suggested that Savannah's murder could have been committed by a serial maniac. In the months leading up to Savannah Anderson's murder, a series of crimes against women aged 17 to 35 occurred in Orange County. Victims were found beaten to death and strangled in their bedrooms. Despite the similar modus operandi, Savannah's case had a number of differences from other incidents. In particular, the killer covered the girl's face, used her jewelry, and washed the body, which did not correspond to the typical behavior of the so-called bedroom killer, as the criminal was dubbed in the media due to the locations where the victims were found. A comparison of fingerprints also did not yield matches with other cases. It became clear that Savannah's case was different from the rest of the series. Investigators suggested that the perpetrator was trying to imitate the style of the bedroom killer to cover his tracks, but made mistakes. Detectives were convinced that the killer was familiar with Savannah, given the towel on her face, so they focused on studying the victim's inner circle. The investigation dragged on for months and years, and even 5 years after the tragedy, there was no breakthrough. The situation changed with the arrival of a new detective who decided to take a fresh look at the case. He immediately rejected the version of a serial killer and again drew attention to the security guards of the residential complex, whose testimonies contained discrepancies and aroused suspicion. In the detective's opinion, the crime could have been spontaneous, and the killer probably felt remorse, which would explain the washing of the body, decoration, and covering of the face. The investigator decided to reinterrogate Chuck Duell and asked him to reproduce the events of the fatal evening in detail. Chuck repeated his previous story, but with some differences. In particular, he recalled that his partner Bob Sellers came to him in the car in a shirt, not in uniform. Chuck also emphasized that he and Bob were not friends and had never spent time together outside of work before. According to Chuck, he agreed to go with Bob because it was calm around the complex, and he himself was hungry. Another important detail was Chuck's confession about Bob's attitude towards Savannah. Allegedly, Robert once let slip that he felt an attraction to the girl who smiled at him. Bob was allegedly determined to ask Savannah out on a date and have sex with her, despite her having a boyfriend. Robert stated that he didn't care about the consequences, but he had to do it. Chuck understood that there could be nothing between them, and Savannah's smile when greeting was just a manifestation of her benevolent nature, not a sign of affection. These new details raised suspicions among the investigators. In particular, the claim about the absence of friendly relations between the guards did not align with their joint trip to the diner and discussion of personal topics. The question arose whether the real killer was trying to shift the blame onto his partner by adding compromising details to the story. Chuck himself claimed that he simply remembered these details after years, but could not explain why he had not turned to the police earlier. Investigators were convinced that one of the guards was behind the murder, so they sent the palm prints of both for re-examination. Thanks to the latest technology, the result was obtained within 24 hours, despite the fact that the prints at the crime scene were previously considered unreadable due to the large amount of blood. Digital analysis confirmed that the killer was none other than Bob Sellers. The new technique made it possible to identify 24 matching points between the bloody print at the crime scene and Robert's palm. At the time of his arrest, Bob was living in his trailer in the city of Brea, California. In the 5 years that had passed, he had managed to get married and have children, although he constantly struggled with difficulties and bad habits, trying to provide for his family. During the interrogation, Bob initially repeated his old version of events and denied involvement in the murder, but under the pressure of evidence, he began to get nervous, get confused, and make mistakes in his testimony. Eventually, after a few hours, Robert confessed that he wanted to tell the truth about the events of that fatal evening. It turned out that Chuck's story about his feelings for Savannah was true. The military man really fell in love with the girl at first sight, but for a long time did not dare to talk to her, mistakenly perceiving her friendly smiles as a manifestation of mutual affection. When on that fateful night Bob saw Savannah talking on the phone with her mother, he decided to act. While Savannah was distracted by the conversation and could not hear what was happening around her, he sneaked into her bedroom through the open window. Bob was convinced that he only needed to confess his love to Savannah, and she would definitely agree to date him, realizing that he was a good guy. And if this plan did not work, then he was ready to persuade her to change her mind by any means. According to Bob, he did not expect that everything would turn out so terribly and go so far. The further development of events became quite predictable for everyone except the killer himself. He clearly expected something different. Probably these strange and inconsistent decisions were connected with the fact that he actively used prohibited substances and was not fully aware of the degree of his imagined foolishness. As soon as 23-year-old Bob Sellers left the bedroom, Savannah had already managed to hang up the phone. She was very frightened, started screaming and tried to drive away the uninvited guest. At this time, Bob continued to repeat again and again that he was a good guy, had feelings for her, so Savannah should give him a chance. Everything went wrong from the start. Savannah did not listen to him, continued to call for help, demanded that Bob get out of her apartment. Realizing that the plan had not worked, Robert became frightened. He did not know what to do, but understood that Savannah had to shut up. The young man was afraid that he would have problems with the law. He would lose his position in the army and in security. Of course, all this was not part of his plans. The guard of the residential complex grabbed the girl and tried to close her mouth with his hand, but this only made the situation worse. Savannah began to resist, tried to run out of the room to call for help outside the apartment. Without thinking twice, Bob hit her several times on the head with a baton. She lost consciousness and fell to the floor. The guy was no longer in control of himself. He knelt down in front of his victim and began to strangle her. After that, Robert got out of Savannah's bedroom. He noticed that Chuck was making his rounds around the residential complex. Fearing that the crime would be exposed, he took off his uniform and crumpled it in his hands so that the blood would not be visible on it. Bob just went home, took a shower there, changed clothes, and decided to return to the murdered woman's apartment. This time, he had the goal of raping the body in order to finally get what he wanted. To suppress the remnants of morality, he took a decent dose of illegal substances. The criminal wanted the body to be clean before the abuse, so he dragged the murdered Savannah into the bathroom and washed her. Then he dressed the girl in all the jewelry he found in her house so that she would be especially beautiful in front of him. Having finished his dirty business, he tried to get out. It was about 3 a.m. From afar, Bob noticed Chuck in his car. He did not suspect that his partner had dozed off and did not see him. To somehow smooth over the situation, he came up with a plan that they needed to go get something to eat. This allowed, on the one hand, to provide himself with an alibi, on the other hand, to provide access to the residential complex to all sorts of dark personalities in order to shift the blame onto them. In any case, Bob was sure that no one would think of a guard. During the first interrogations at the police, Robert lied about the time as he wanted to confuse the investigation. Fortunately for the criminal, this was not necessary. Finally, thanks to the examination, the police had strong evidence against the criminal. On March 29, 1984, 28-year-old Bob was charged with murder, attempted rape, and abuse of a corpse. Strong evidence and a recording of his confession helped quickly convince the jury of his guilt. But the criminal's lawyer was not going to give up, because the death penalty for the defendant was on the horizon. According to the defense attorney, the prosecutor's office did not have material evidence that would reasonably assert whether the rape was committed before or after the murder. Despite the criminal's confession, the lawyer managed to find a loophole in his words and refute the opinion of the prosecutor's office. The lawyer insisted that it was all the fault of Robert's altered state after using drugs. Moreover, Bob worked 2 jobs, was very overworked, slept poorly, and insomnia also affected him. In this state, the guard simply could not control himself, which became the cause of the tragedy. To confirm his words, he cited the testimony of Bob's friends, relatives, and fellow servicemen. They all unanimously claimed that Robert had never raised his hand against women, was a harmless, decent person who was simply not capable of murder. In the end, in order not to delay the proceedings, the killer was offered a plea bargain. He agreed to plead guilty to first-degree murder, after which he was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of early release after 25 years behind bars. To this day, he continues to serve his sentence in prison. Savannah's death shocked her loved ones the most. Family and friends knew that Savannah had moved to the apartment for safety reasons. She repeatedly stated that under the protection of round-the-clock security, she would feel much calmer than at her former place of residence. This residential complex was recommended to her by her boss. No one could even imagine that the person called to protect would turn out to be a murderer. Interestingly, the criminal, who had brutally beaten the girl to death, had never been held responsible for any criminal episodes before or after the crime. His biography was carefully checked. Now the question arose, did he kill during all these 5 years before his arrest, remaining unpunished? In any case, involvement in other crimes could not be proven. As for the other victims, 7 women who were killed differently than Savannah, Bob denied his probable participation. The former guard seemed to the police a suitable suspect for such episodes, but during the check, he was removed from the list of probable criminals due to the mismatch of fingerprints. Later, the bedroom killer was still caught, and he turned out to be a man named Jared Parker. Of the 11 attacks, 5 of his victims survived and identified him. The man was found guilty of 6 murders and rapes, as well as 5 attempted murders. In '96, Gerald was sentenced to death, which has not yet taken place. The tragedy that happened to Savannah Anderson is a horrific example of how obsessive infatuation, unhealthy passions, and uncontrolled aggression can lead to fatal consequences. This story demonstrates that even people called to protect and guard are capable of the most terrible crimes. Bob Sellers, the guard of the residential complex, allowed his irrational feelings for Savannah to grow into an obsession. His distorted perception of reality, amplified by drug use, led to the brutal murder of an innocent girl. This tragedy reminds us of the importance of timely recognition and control of our emotions, as well as the danger of obsessive ideas. One of the key factors that contributed to the tragedy was Bob's abuse of narcotic substances. This once again emphasizes the destructive impact of drugs on a person's psyche and their ability to exercise self-control. Combating drug addiction and the availability of illicit drugs is an important step towards preventing such crimes. Savannah's story also makes us think about the importance of careful selection of personnel, especially when it comes to work in the field of security and protection. After all, people who hold such positions should not only be professionals in their field, but also morally stable individuals. Perhaps a more meticulous selection and regular psychological checks of employees would have helped to identify the potential danger posed by Bob Sellers. At the same time, this tragedy reminds us that no one is immune from encountering evil, even in places that seem safe. Therefore, each of us must be vigilant, trust our intuition, and not neglect potential signs of danger. If someone's behavior causes concern or seems strange, one should not remain silent. It is necessary to report this to the appropriate authorities or people you trust. I would like as many people as possible to watch this episode, especially women who don't notice the red flags in their relationships with loved ones. Today, we will examine one of the most intriguing and mysterious cases I have ever investigated, which happened in Philadelphia, USA, in 2011, the case of Ellen Ray Greenberg. This case caused a lot of controversy and discrepancies among both law enforcement and the victim's family, as the cause of death remains unclear to this day. However, despite the complexity and ambiguity of this case, it undoubtedly deserves attention due to its mysteriousness and unusual nature. Ellen Greenberg was born on June 23, 1993 in New York, and was the only child of George and Sandra Greenberg. At the time of the tragic events, the girl was 27 years old and lived in Philadelphia. Ellen grew up in an atmosphere of love and care, and was a cheerful and sociable girl. During her school years, she was actively involved in sports, particularly softball and golf, achieving considerable success and demonstrating remarkable competitiveness. In addition, Ellen was distinguished by her sociability and ability to find common ground with people. According to her mother, Ellen had a special gift for bringing people together around her. Ellen had an incredibly strong love for animals and willingly helped them by visiting specialized shelters for stray animals. Her mother called Ellen a white angel of kindness who wouldn't hurt a fly. After successfully graduating from high school, Ellen entered the University of Pennsylvania, where she received a diploma with high honors as a communications specialist. However, over time, she realized that this was not her true calling. Therefore, Ellen continued her studies in the evening department of the university until she obtained a teacher's diploma, and shortly after graduation she was fortunate to get a job as a first-grade teacher in Philadelphia. Ellen loved children to death, which explained her choice of profession. The year 2008 became a fateful one for Ellen because that's when she met Samuel Goldberg, a representative of a well-known and influential local family. Romantic feelings flared up between the young people, and they were so fascinated with each other that they soon decided to live together. And already in 2011, shortly before the terrible events, the couple got engaged and planned to get married in August. Ellen was on cloud nine with happiness and enthusiastically prepared for the wedding, trying on the dress, sending out invitations, not even suspecting what an unexpected and dramatic turn awaited her ahead. And then came that fateful day, January 20th, 2011. On that day, when Ellen was at work, a severe snowstorm began in Philadelphia, forcing schools to close early. Ellen hurried home to the apartment she rented with her fiancé Samuel. Around 5 o'clock in the evening, the man went to the gym, not suspecting that he was seeing his beloved for the last time. Approximately an hour later, at 5:45, having returned home, he was surprised to find that the door to the apartment was locked from the inside. Sam knocked several times, calling out Ellen's name, then tried to call her and even sent 9 text messages, but received no response. In despair, the man went downstairs, hoping that the building's security guard would help him break down the door. However, the guard refused, referring to the fact that he had no right to leave his post, so Sam had to act on his own. With the first blow, he managed to knock out the door. But unfortunately, inside he was met with a horrifying sight. Ellen was sitting on the kitchen floor, leaning against the cabinets, covered in numerous wounds. Without wasting a second, Sam called the rescue service 911. The dispatcher, after listening to his story, advised him to check if Ellen was breathing and, if possible, perform artificial respiration. However, as he was about to follow these instructions, the man noticed that a knife was sticking out of his fiancée's chest, making it impossible to start resuscitation. And apparently, it was already too late. Ellen showed no signs of life. When the police arrived at the scene and began their inspection, it became clear that no one had broken into the apartment, as the door was locked with a latch from the inside, and there were no signs of a struggle or disorder inside. Moreover, Sam had to knock down the door, otherwise it was impossible to get inside. Accordingly, the likelihood that an intruder had entered the apartment was extremely low. The police also noted the absence of any wounds on the victim's hands that would be characteristic of self-defense. At the same time, despite the number and severity of the injuries sustained, the version that Ellen could have inflicted them on herself seemed unlikely. However, without waiting for the results of the forensic medical examination, law enforcement officers concluded that Ellen had taken her own life, although no suicide note was found at the scene to explain the motives for such an act. An interesting fact was that there was fruit on the kitchen table. Obviously, Ellen was going to make a fruit salad, and suddenly it occurred to her to take her own life? Samuel was taken to the police station to give evidence, and the girl's parents were informed of the tragic news by phone. Shocked with grief, they lived in Harrisburg, a 2-hour drive from Philadelphia. They could not believe that they had lost their only daughter, and under such circumstances. However, the very next day, the conclusion about the cause of Ellen's death changed. The autopsy revealed the presence of 20 stab wounds, 10 of which were located in the chest area in the front, and another 10 in the neck area in the back. According to the forensic expert, the nature of the injuries indicated that it was a murder, not a suicide. In addition, hematomas of varying degrees of age were found on the victim's body. It seemed incredible that Ellen could have inflicted injuries on herself in the occipital region, especially since at least 2 of the wounds to the neck were extremely deep and could have caused loss of consciousness. Inflicting such a number of wounds, especially considering the head injury, would have required extraordinary strength and endurance. And would Ellen, after all this, have been able to stab herself in the heart? Because that's exactly the position in which the knife was found. Thus, the version that Ellen could have inflicted injuries on herself in the occipital region raised serious doubts, especially considering that at least 2 wounds to the neck were so deep that they could have led to loss of consciousness. Moreover, inflicting such a number of wounds on herself, especially after a serious head injury, would have required extraordinary strength and endurance. Moreover, it is hard to believe that after 19 previous injuries, Ellen would have been able to stab herself in the heart. Would it have been possible to do this alone? However, despite all these arguments, the police rejected the coroner's version of murder, although it seemed the most likely to Ellen's family and loved ones. Instead, the authorities insisted that Ellen had taken her own life. Investigators justified their position by the absence of any signs of the presence of outsiders at the scene, doors locked from the inside, and the testimony of neighbors who heard nothing suspicious except for Sam's shouting for Ellen through the closed door. Moreover, the DNA analysis taken from the knife revealed only the prints of the deceased herself. As for the bruises on the body, The police explained their appearance by the girl's participation in contact sports, although in recent years she had not been engaged in any sports activities at all. On the other hand, law enforcement also studied Ellen's psychological state on the eve of the tragedy and learned from her parents that during this period she was struggling with anxiety and was even taking 2 different medications, both of which could cause side effects in the form of life-threatening thoughts and behaviors. However, the psychiatrist Ellen consulted assured that she did not notice any signs of suicidal tendencies in her. And during the last session that took place 2 weeks before the fatal events, Ellen seemed quite happy and satisfied with life. The doctor also noted that the patient never mentioned being subjected to any cruel treatment by anyone, which was confirmed by her parents, who characterized their daughter as a sensitive, cheerful, and positively minded person. In fact, no one from her inner circle could believe that Ellen was capable of causing herself such terrible injuries. After all, she was in anticipation of a happy future, actively preparing for the wedding, trying on the dress, and sending out invitations literally a few days before the tragedy. And although the girl's mother and friends admitted that lately she had been experiencing some anxiety and stress related to work and wedding preparations, there was nothing extraordinary about it. The mere thought that Ellen could have decided to commit suicide on the eve of her own wedding absolutely did not correspond to her character and worldview. Given the stark contradictions between the forensic expert's conclusion about a violent death and the police's position insisting on suicide, the doctor decided to send a sample of the deceased's spinal cord tissue for additional examination to a neuropathologist from the Bureau of Forensic Medicine, hoping to establish the truth in this way. The fact is that if at least one of the deep wounds to the neck had damaged the spinal cord, it would inevitably have led to paralysis and deprived the victim of the ability to inflict further injuries on herself. Therefore, the presence of 20 wounds of varying severity on the body indicated the involvement of another person in the crime. However, 3 months later, the forensic expert suddenly abandoned his initial version of murder, stating that the incised wounds on the neck were not serious enough to cause paralysis, and accordingly could well have been inflicted by Ellen herself. The girl's parents never received a clear explanation for the reasons behind such a radical change in the expert's position. They could not believe that their daughter, who was so vulnerable and sensitive to pain that she did not even dare to pierce her ears a second time, suddenly turned out to be capable of such a desperate and cruel act. The most shocking and outrageous thing for the family was the authorities' announcement about the final closure of the case, contrary to all arguments and evidence. However, Ellen's relatives were not going to give up and decided to start their own investigation, even despite the significant financial costs that it required. They involved leading experts in the field of forensic medicine and criminology, such as Kirill Klein and Henry Lee, who questioned the official coroner's report on suicide. By the way, the forensic expert himself admitted back in 2012 that the probability of the girl's violent death was quite high. The authoritative forensic pathologist Cyril Wecht also noted that, according to statistics, women rarely use sharp objects for suicide and usually do not inflict wounds on themselves through clothing. In addition, an experienced detective and criminalist named Brennan, who offered his services to the Greenberg family free of charge, studied the photos and video materials from the scene and discovered that the nature of the blood traces did not correspond to the position of Ellen's body, who was allegedly sitting leaning against the kitchen cabinets. Instead, a horizontal strip of clotted blood was noticed on the wall, which contradicted the laws of gravity, and blood splatters on the victim's boots indicated that at the time of receiving the injuries, she was in an upright position. All these facts led the detective to think that the original setting at the scene of the tragedy had been changed, and the girl's body had been moved. Despite the persistent efforts of the victim's family, their lawyer failed to achieve a revision of the official version of the investigation, since this required more substantial evidence. It seemed that the case had reached a dead end and was doomed to oblivion. However, in 2015, Andrea, an assistant district attorney in the Homicide Investigation Department, became interested in it. His attention was drawn to the strange circumstances of the event, and he decided to carefully study all the available evidence, trying to understand what could really have pushed the young woman to such a desperate step. As it became known from the testimony of Ellen's fiancé, on the day of the tragedy, The apartment door was locked from the inside, so he had to break it down to get inside. However, analyzing the photos from the scene, Andrea noticed that the lock was an ordinary hotel-type latch that could be closed not only from inside the room, but also from the outside, simply by turning the screw. Moreover, as one of the experts noted, this type of lock cannot be opened by simply kicking the door with your foot without damaging the door frame. The only damage found on the door was the absence of a screw. The police also emphasized the fact that no wounds were found on Ellen's body that would indicate self-defense. Because of this, it was impossible to establish the exact sequence of injuries, but it can be said with certainty that the last blow was directed at the heart, where the knife remained. Although, if one of the neck injuries had damaged the spinal cord, the victim would have had no chance to resist, right? Andrea's attention was also drawn to the wound on Ellen's head, the nature of which indicated that she was likely attacked from behind. So the assistant prosecutor decided to clarify this point with the forensic expert. He was informed that the neuropathologist who examined the spine did not find any damage. Andrea asked for an official conclusion that would confirm the absence of spinal injuries. But to his surprise, it turned out that such a document simply does not exist. It had disappeared somewhere. It turns out that this information was nothing more than a rumor that no one had actually seen. Moreover, it turned out that at the time of these events, there was no staff neuropathologist at the Bureau of Forensic Medicine at all. Therefore, they had to invite Dr. Adams, who supposedly examined the spine and confirmed the absence of any damage. But later it became known that no records of instructing this doctor to conduct an examination had been preserved. In a 2018 interview, when asked about this case, Dr. Adams admitted that she did not remember ever examining Ellen's spine. After all, such a unique case could hardly have faded from memory. In fact, it turned out that Dr. Adams had never conducted this examination. Having learned about this, Andrea contacted the private detective hired by the Greenberg family and advised them to invite an independent neuropathologist. The reason for this was that the assistant prosecutor found out that a sample of Ellen's spine was still stored in the Bureau of Forensic Medicine, which seemed extremely suspicious to him because there were no good reasons for this. The family followed the advice and hired Dr. Ross. His conclusion fundamentally contradicted the probable official reports. According to the expert's conclusion, the girl's spinal cord was damaged, that is, pierced by 2 deep wounds on the neck. Under such circumstances, Ellen would not have been physically able to inflict further injuries on herself. At the same time, Andrea realized that all the data used by the police were provided by Sam, the victim's fiancé, who was at the scene, and this was the only person who saw what really happened in that apartment. According to Samuel, he left Ellen alone for about 45 minutes, and when he returned, the doors were locked from the inside. The neighbors confirmed that they heard the man calling the bride's name through the closed door. Then, according to his own testimony, seized with anxiety, he began to call the girl and then sent her 9 text messages. Having received no answer, Sam went downstairs to the building security guard to ask if he had any tools to open the door, but he refused. Later in his explanations, Samuel noted that he went to the concierge several times, trying to persuade him to help break down the door. However, in his official testimony to the police, the man claimed that the guard was supposedly next to him when he kicked down the door and entered the apartment. This information was refuted by the concierge himself, assuring both law enforcement officers and Ellen's relatives that he was at his post the whole time and definitely did not accompany Sam during his entry into the apartment. The guard also noted another interesting detail. Samuel, who allegedly returned from the gym, was wearing shoes, not sneakers. In addition, Andrea was alarmed by the fact that the man did not immediately call 911, but first decided to break into the apartment, although it would seem that if you are really worried about a loved one and suspect that something has happened to them, the first reaction should be to call the emergency services. After listening to the recording of Sam's conversation with the 911 dispatcher, the assistant prosecutor noted a surprisingly calm tone of his voice for such an extreme situation.
Help! I need a emergency now. I just walked to my apartment. My fiance's on the floor with blood everywhere.
What is the address?
4601 Flat Rock Road. Please come. Help! Now!
4601
Flat Rock Road.
Is this a house or apartment?
Oh no! Oh no! It's an apartment.
What apartment number?
Please hurry, please.
Where is she bleeding from?
I don't know. I can't tell.
So you have to calm yourself down in order to get you some help.
I'm sorry. I don't know. I'm looking at her right now. I can't see anything. There's nothing broken. She's bleeding. Ellie!
You don't know where she's bleeding from? Can't see where the blood's coming from?
I think her head. I think she hit her head, But it's everywhere.
Okay,
it's everywhere.
She might have fallen. Do you know what happened?
She may have slipped. There's blood on the table. Her face is a little purple.
Okay, hold on for rescue for her. Stay on the phone.
Philadelphia Fire Department 842. What's the address? No,
4601 Flat Rock Road. Please hurry.
4601 Flat Rock?
Yes.
What's wrong?
I went downstairs to go work out. I came back up. The door was latched. My fiance's inside. She wasn't answering. So after about a half hour, I decided to break it down. I see her now just on the floor with blood. She's not responding.
Okay, is she breathing? Look at her chest. I need you to calm down, and I need you to look at her chest. It's really.
I don't think she. I really don't think she is.
Listen to me. Someone's on the way. Look at her chest. Is she flat on her back?
She's on her back. So I bring her.
Look at her chest and tell me if it's going up and down, up and down.
I don't see her moving.
Okay. Do you know how to do CPR?
I don't.
Okay, I can tell you what to do. Okay, until they get there. I want you to keep her flat on her.
God.
Hello.
Yeah, hi, okay.
Are you willing to do CPR with me over the phone until they get there?
I have to, right?
Okay, so get her flat on her back, bare her chest, okay? You want to rip her shirt off. Okay? Kneel down by her side.
Oh, my God. Ellie, please.
Listen, you can't freak out, sir, because you
Okay, I'm trying not to. Her shirt won't come off. It's a zipper. Oh, my God. She stabbed herself.
Where?
She fell with a knife. Oh, no, her knife's sticking out.
There was no despair or shock in his intonations. Moreover, when the rescue service operator asked him to describe what had happened, Samuel ignored this request and continued to talk about how he went to the gym and then returned home. Another interesting fact that the Greenberg family's lawyer drew attention to was the probable movement of the body after death. This was evidenced by the characteristic traces of bruises on the skin, which could have been formed as a result of dragging the victim across the floor. In addition, this version was also supported by the remains of blood on the floor, indicating that Ellen had been lying in a different place for some time. And when the 911 dispatcher began instructing Samuel on how to provide first aid and conduct cardiopulmonary resuscitation, a completely inappropriate question was heard in response whether he really needed to do this. Then, supposedly for 2 or 3 minutes, the man tried to carry out resuscitation measures, after which he suddenly informed the operator that he had just noticed a knife sticking out of Ellen's chest. That is, all this time he was next to the body, but for some reason did not see the instrument of the crime. And importantly, it was not some inconspicuous object, but a huge butcher knife about 10 inches long, which was practically impossible not to notice. However, despite this, after discovering the knife, Samuel for some reason suggested that his fiancée had probably accidentally fallen on the blade. Strange, isn't it? Samuel was taken to the police station to give testimony, but he agreed to do so only in the presence of his lawyer, and limited himself to an extremely laconic statement. After that, the man never spoke to the investigators again, despite repeated attempts by law enforcement officers to interrogate him, especially after information emerged that Ellen had allegedly inflicted fatal wounds on herself. It was clear that it was no longer possible to force Samuel to testify. All these circumstances only strengthened the conviction of the victim's family that the girl had been deprived of life. In 2016, a neuropathologist working on behalf of the Greenberg family discovered signs of strangulation and hemorrhages, in addition to perforation of the spinal cord. On the other hand, many experts who viewed the video footage from the crime scene were extremely surprised by the minuscule amount of blood, given the victim's 20 stab wounds. This led to suspicion that the room had been thoroughly cleaned. However, for some reason, the investigation never resorted to the use of luminol, a substance critical for detecting blood traces in such cases. The police did not even bother to examine the trash can after inspecting the crime scene. All they did was come, take a cursory look around, assume that Ellen had committed suicide, and didn't even post a guard to ensure the inviolability of the apartment's environment. Moreover, as it turned out, the very next day after the tragic events, Sam's uncles and cousins appeared in the apartment allegedly for his suit. However, they left the crime scene not only with clothes, but also with the laptops of both Sam and Ellen, and also took the girl's mobile phone. And only on January 29th, that is, 3 days later, all these items were officially seized by police officers. An examination of the laptop showed that they had been used to search for information on how to end one's life. However, the official report dated April 2011 did not mention these allegedly discovered facts. Moreover, Andrea did not find a single document in the district attorney's files that would contain the results of a computer forensic examination. Again, there was a phantom, non-existent analysis. Given all these circumstances, the views of Ellen's parents and friends on her psychological state on the eve of the tragedy, as well as on Samuel's reputation, changed somewhat. And although they never directly called him a suspect or a likely perpetrator, certain doubts still crept in. Upon reflection, the girl's relatives and friends admitted that they had indeed noticed changes in her behavior a few weeks before the fatal incident, but did not attach much importance to it at the time. Ellen's girlfriends recalled that lately, she had begun to consult with Samuel about every decision she made, which had not been observed before. If previously Ellen demonstrated complete independence, then on the eve of the tragedy, she turned from a cheerful and carefree person into a restless and anxious one. Ellen even once confessed to her parents that she wanted to quit her job and return home to them. However, she emphasized that Samuel had nothing to do with it, and that everything was fine in their relationship. Ellen's parents assured their daughter that they were always happy to see her at home and were ready to support her if needed. And they advised her to seek help regarding her anxiety problems. In 2019, the deputy coroner and dean of the Faculty of Medical Sciences, Gregory McDonald's, released a report confirming the police version. He claimed that Ellen had inflicted the superficial wounds on herself. Because if a person decides to take their own life in this way, they usually start with shallow cuts, as if testing their determination and pain threshold. And then in the process, they inflict more and more serious injuries on themselves. But on the other hand, the nature of the deep wounds and other traces that could indicate an attack still seemed suspicious to the expert. Samuel maintained contact with the family of his late fiancée for a year after the tragedy. But then his calls and visits became less and less frequent, and soon he completely broke off communication, sending the Greenbergs an email with a message about his own wedding. Currently, this man is still married, has 2 children, and leads a completely normal, ordinary life, absolutely detached from the exhausting struggle that Ellen's family continues, trying to figure out why justice neglected their grief and did not help establish the truth. The girl's parents, together with a lawyer, filed a lawsuit against the experts who performed the autopsy, against the Bureau of Forensic Medicine, the county administration, and the city of Philadelphia. They demanded a review of the case and a change in the wording of the cause of death, due to which the investigation was prematurely closed. And only in May 2020, the first ray of hope appeared. The Philadelphia court granted the Greenbergs' claim. In this regard, the family hopes to gain access to all the materials of the criminal proceedings, which they have been denied so far. In addition, there is a video recording from surveillance cameras in the building, which allegedly does not show anything suspicious. It only records the time when Sam left the apartment and returned. A request was also made to obtain an audio recording of conversations with 911 dispatchers. However, due to the pandemic, all these procedures had to be postponed, and the exact date of the court hearing, tentatively scheduled for 2021, has not yet been determined. If the court does establish that Ellen's death was violent, the case will be reclassified as murder and the investigation will resume. Although given the many lost opportunities and miscalculations at the initial stage of the investigation, many important pieces of evidence have unfortunately been lost forever, such as the luminol examination, which was never carried out, which is very, very strange. Ellen's parents created a special Facebook page called Justice for Ellen, where they inform the public about the progress of the case. But most importantly, they do not let people forget about the tragic fate of their daughter. They sincerely believe that sooner or later the truth will prevail. As of today, the situation looks like this. In July 2022, the Attorney General's Office of the State of Pennsylvania closed the case, officially acknowledging the existence of a conflict of interest. Today, the Ellen Greenberg case has been transferred to the Chester County Prosecutor's Office, where a new group of investigators and a prosecutor have been appointed to re-examine the case files. This news became a long-awaited ray of hope for the parents of the deceased girl, who all this time insisted that their daughter could not have voluntarily taken her own life. However, friends, relatives of Ellen, and even outsiders who have become familiar with the details of this confusing story continue to consider it extremely suspicious and unusual. Most of them have no trust in the official police version. There are too many blind spots and understatements in this case. After all, quite often, violence in couples flares up precisely after the engagement when the bride and groom are preparing for the wedding. It is quite possible that when faced with cruel treatment and beatings by her fiancé after the proposal, Ellen was at a loss and could not clearly formulate and voice this problem. Perhaps that is why she did not dare to tell her parents or therapist about her suffering. It's worth imagining here you are in a 3-year relationship with a person you thought you knew well. Suddenly, your partner unexpectedly changes, reveals their true essence, and resorts to violence against you. It is possible that Ellen deluded herself that this stressful situation would soon pass. Everything would be settled and life would return to its usual course. But unfortunately for this bride and future wife, everything ended in the most tragic way. In fact, even a cursory analysis of the circumstances of the event indicates obvious signs of murder, and a murder that is deliberately hushed up. Because how is it possible to inflict such severe and numerous injuries on oneself alone? It seems absolutely unreal. First, Ellen would not have been able to continue inflicting blows on herself after deep damage to the spinal cord. And we are not talking about some scratches, but about extremely serious wounds. After such injuries, paralysis usually occurs, and a person loses the ability to move, let alone the ability to inflict further blows on themselves. And this is without taking into account the wound on the back of the head, the depth of which reached 6 centimeters. It is quite likely that this particular blow was fatal. So how, for heaven's sake, did the investigators manage to qualify this case as suicide? It's just beyond common sense. Characteristic signs of strangulation on the victim's neck were also present. In general, the location of all the wounds unequivocally indicates that the attacker was behind Ellen. In addition, Samuel's cautious behavior seems extremely suspicious. Is it possible that a man who had just discovered the mutilated body of his beloved a few minutes ago was able to instantly come to his senses so much as to call a lawyer and then give extremely laconic and evasive testimony without going into details? No, I will never believe it. In such a terrible and stressful situation, any normal person would be in a state of deep shock and affect. It is unlikely that anyone would be capable of such careful, thought-out, and logical actions. And there's no need to talk about the obvious negligence, and even indifference on the part of the investigation and forensic experts. All potentially important evidence was ignored. Key examinations were not assigned and not carried out. How inept and incompetent do you have to be to not notice in this case numerous signs of violent deprivation of life and mindlessly approve the version of suicide? And why did this happen? Let me express my own assumption because in fact, all this was planned, like a carefully thought out scenario. The only thing that does not fit in the head is who you need to be and what connections you need to have in order to hide such a number of indisputable evidence of a crime. Are there grounds for seeing a corruption component in this case? Undoubtedly. Was all this deliberately staged? I have no doubt. Of course, you can condemn me for such conclusions, but excuse me, my imagination simply refuses to draw a picture where a person inflicts more than 20 knife blows on themselves, having strangled themselves before that, and then crawls to the sink in the bathroom. And why do I tend to think that it was Sam who was involved in Ellen's death, and not anyone else? I'll explain. Firstly, he was the last one to leave the apartment before the body was discovered. Secondly, he was the only one who had an obvious motive for killing the girl, possibly in connection with a parallel affair on the side. Thirdly, his behavior after the tragedy was at least strange. He remained impassive and calm, and a year later, as if nothing had happened, he married another woman. Usually people who have experienced such a terrible loss withdraw for at least 3 years, and only then gradually return to normal life. In my opinion, a ruthless and cold-blooded killer is looking at you from the screen, who most likely acted in collusion with corrupt law enforcement officers, who should also be brought to justice. Unfortunately, this case is far from the only example of the striking inaction and negligence on the part of representatives of the justice system in Philadelphia. America, what is happening to you? Such cases are becoming widespread, and they are all united by a common shameful feature: unwillingness and inability to help the afflicted in their search for justice. One can only hope that Ellen's elderly parents will still be able to find the desired answers that have been haunting them for more than a decade. What do you think about this eerie and confusing story? Share your own thoughts in the comments. The story of Ellen Greenberg is not just another episode of a crime chronicle. It is a painful reminder of the deep problems that, unfortunately, still afflict modern society. Why do such tragedies continue to occur with such eerie regularity? Because indifference, and unwillingness to notice obvious things are firmly rooted in our collective consciousness. The central coast of New South Wales in Australia conceals a place with a grim reputation: Snapper Point, also known as the Deadly Cliffs. Despite being a popular tourist attraction, especially among fishing enthusiasts, this location is notorious for its steep, jagged cliffs. It's not uncommon for people to fall from these slopes straight into the turbulent ocean or get swept away by sudden waves. In recent years, at least 16 tourists have lost their lives in this area. However, as practice shows, it's not always just a blind chance or the whims of nature that cause these deaths. This story is about one such case. On April 24, 2016, around 10:30 in the morning, several visiting fishermen were going about their business near Snapper Point. Suddenly, some of them, looking down from the cliffs, noticed a strange object beating against the waves. It quickly became clear that it was a body wrapped in black plastic, another victim of the treacherous Deadly Cliffs. One of the witnesses immediately reported the gruesome find to the police. Soon, a rescue helicopter arrived at the scene to retrieve the body, which was lying face down. But from the first glance, the specialist realized that this was no mere accident. The discovered body belonged to a young girl and had over 30 stab wounds. Particularly deep blows were inflicted on the neck, and there were traces on the hands and wrists indicating desperate attempts to defend herself. Unfortunately, the victim's clothing was never found, which significantly complicated the process of identifying her. The primary task for the police was to establish the identity of the deceased, and only then reconstruct the chain of events that led the girl to the medical examiner's table. But recognizing her proved to be difficult. There were no distinctive features or characteristic details of appearance. The expert determined that death occurred as a result of a brutal stabbing, and the defensive wounds on the hands indicated that the girl fought for her life until the very end. The fact that the body was found naked suggested a probable rape, but it was impossible to confirm or refute this version. The water washed away all potential evidence. To help identify the victim, law enforcement officers created a computer reconstruction of her appearance and published it online, dubbing the deceased Snapper Point Jane Doe. The girl had Asian facial features, looked to be 20 to 35 years old, was of average build, about 5 feet 7 inches tall, with dark chestnut shoulder-length hair. The condition of the body suggested that it had been in the water for a relatively short time. Questioning fishermen and other potential witnesses yielded no results. No one saw anyone throw a dead girl from the cliffs into the water. The police began a large-scale check of all recently missing persons in the region, both local residents and tourists. Special attention was paid to those who might have lost contact with loved ones, friends, or girlfriends. At the same time, an active search was underway among foreigners who had recently arrived in Australia. And so, quite quickly, people responded who noticed a striking resemblance between the mysterious victim and a Chinese student who had come to Australia on an exchange 4 years ago. They immediately reported this to the police. The very next Friday after the body was discovered, the detectives working on the case were able to establish the identity of the deceased. She turned out to be 25-year-old Michelle Leng, who had gone missing at the time of her death. As it turned out, Michelle lived in the suburb of Campsie, in Sydney, about 100 kilometers from the place where her mutilated body was found. And here's a chilling coincidence. Just a year before her death, the girl took a photo on the very cliff from which her dead body was later thrown. In the picture, Michelle posed against the backdrop of water and cliffs, as if anticipating her own fate. When the media picked up this news, rumors began to spread that the girl had come to this place to meet a guy she had met online, and this date turned out to be fatal for her. Journalists spun the version that an unknown suitor literally lured Michelle to her death, but the police promptly worked out this version and refuted it. A detailed analysis of the girl's correspondence in messengers showed that she did not meet anyone and did not plan any meetings. So who and why did someone need to cut short the life of a young student? To answer this question, investigators had to delve deeper into the details of Michelle's life and surroundings. The nature of the crime, extreme brutality, and a large number of stab wounds indicated a personal motive. The police did not abandon hope of finding the killer's trail. It was established that Michelle Leng was born in China in 1991 and had been very close to her mother, Mei Jiang, all her life. Michelle Leng's life path was full of trials from a young age. A heavy blow to the family was the death of the girl's father during a devastating earthquake that occurred in her hometown in China. This tragedy not only took the life of the closest person, but also put the family in a difficult financial situation. However, despite all the hardships, mother and daughter became even more united in the face of difficulties. Their relationship became stronger, and their emotional bond became unbreakable. Michelle acutely felt responsible for the fate of her mother and understood that without her support, they were unlikely to survive. It was then, in search of a better life and opportunities to help her family, that the girl made the decision to radically change her life. She began to consider options for moving to another country, where she could find a promising job and get a quality education. And her choice fell on distant Australia. In 2011, full of hope and expectations, Michelle Leng arrived in Sydney, the largest city on the green continent. The girl was sure that it was here, in this metropolis of opportunities, that she would be able to realize her dreams and ambitions. And at first, it seemed that fate was smiling upon her. Michelle adapted to the new realities fairly quickly, made new friends, and settled her life. She became a student at the University of Technology, Sydney, choosing economics and business as her specialty. In parallel with her studies, the girl found a job in order to be able to financially support her mother. It is worth noting that Michelle, without hesitation, sent her first salary to her mother in China. And from then on, every month she transferred money to her family, because deep in her heart, she understood how important her help was for them. In Australia, Michelle was lucky with housing. She did not have to rent an apartment, because her relatives themselves suggested that the girl should live with them in an apartment complex in the Sydney suburb of Campsie. There she lived with her 48-year-old aunt, her teenage son from a previous marriage, and her 28-year-old uncle, Derek Barrett, who was Michelle's second cousin and had been married to her aunt since 2012. For the girl's mother, this arrangement was a great relief because she knew that her daughter was under the supervision of relatives. This gave her peace of mind and confidence that nothing bad would happen to Michelle, and the girl herself enjoyed the company of close relatives. She had a warm, trusting relationship with her aunt and uncle. They seemed to Michelle to be decent, reliable people with whom one could not only share a roof over their heads, but also share the most intimate things. In addition, living with family allowed the girl to send more money to her mother, because it was possible to significantly save on housing rent. To better understand what kind of person Michelle was, investigators thoroughly studied her social media pages. There they searched for the smallest details, seemingly insignificant facts that could shed light on the identity of the deceased, and most importantly, lead to the trail of the killer. Law enforcement officers scrupulously analyzed the girl's posts, comments, likes, and photos. They checked recent calls and messages, to understand who Michelle had been communicating with recently, what plans and intentions she had. This work was painstaking but extremely necessary. From the profiles on social networks, a picture emerged of a happy life of a young girl, filled with bright moments. Michelle often shared positive emotions and life-affirming thoughts with friends, loved to philosophize on topics that excited her soul. Among the publications, there were many selfies with friends against the backdrop of picturesque Australian landscapes. A special place was occupied by culinary masterpieces, which Michelle loved to show off so much. The girl adored cooking and sharing the results of her efforts on the web. It seemed that Michelle lived a tasty life in every sense of the word. Together with her friends, she often visited cafes and restaurants, tried new dishes, and studied the intricacies of local cuisine. Another passion of hers was animals, nature, and beaches. Photos from the picturesque corners of Australia appeared on the girl's pages from time to time. However, despite the richness of the newsfeed, the detectives could not find any hint of any suspicious acquaintances or dangerous connections. Then the investigators decided to talk to Michelle's closest circle, her friends and housemates. From them, it became known that the girl last got in touch on April 21st, 2016. Then she told her friends that she was planning a trip to the mall for shopping. Around noon, Michelle got on a train and went about her business. Later, the police obtained footage from surveillance cameras at the shopping center. They clearly showed the girl strolling between the rows of stores, trying things on, and buying new clothes in different departments. Her entire route through the mall was traced in detail, up to the moment when Michelle boarded the return train to Campsie. But what happened to the girl next remained a mystery. After all, there were no cameras along the way from the station to the house where Michelle lived. The last clue was that the girl logged into her media platform one more time after returning, but then her online activity stopped. Most likely, it was at that moment that something terrible happened to her. It was also strange that Michelle disappeared on Thursday, and already on Sunday, her mutilated body was found tens of kilometers from home, on the cliffs at Snapper Point. And the first to fall under suspicion were her housemates, her aunt with her husband and their son. The woman confessed to the police that on the day of her niece's disappearance, she was in another city on business, so she did not even know whether Michelle had returned from shopping. But her husband, the deceased's uncle Derek Barrett, allegedly spent the whole evening at home. According to him, they had dinner together and then he went to bed. When he woke up in the morning, Michelle was already gone. The man assumed that his niece, like many girls her age, was having fun somewhere with friends, maybe even stayed overnight with someone. So at first, no one attached much importance to this. But when the girl did not show up at home on Saturday, Derek became worried. He began to write messages to Michelle, but in response, silence. The girl's mother, who was used to communicating with her daughter every day, was no less worried. Usually they talked a lot on the phone, but this time, Michelle seemed to have vanished into thin air. The aunt, returning home on Sunday, decided to look into her niece's room, and two things alerted her. Firstly, all of Michelle's things were in their places. It seemed that the girl was not going to go anywhere for a long time. And secondly, perfect cleanliness reigned in the room, as if Michelle had put things in order before something. And this was also very strange. The aunt and uncle, shocked by the suspicious circumstances of Michelle's disappearance, decided to contact the police. Their statement was received almost simultaneously with the message from the girl's friends, who actively disseminated information about her disappearance on the web. Thanks to Michelle's wide circle of acquaintances, the news of her disappearance spread like lightning across the internet and became public knowledge. The publication on the Chinese website Weibo turned out to be especially resonant. It helped to link the unidentified body found on the cliffs with the missing student. Detectives, having processed all available information about Michelle, came to the conclusion that the girl had no obvious ill-wishers. In addition, she was quite smart and savvy to stand up for herself if necessary. Cheerful and sociable, Michelle was unlikely to become a victim of a targeted murder. So the police suggested that it could have been an attack by some maniac operating in the area. However, no other similar crimes were recorded in the area. While Michelle's killer was freely roaming at large, the public was increasingly worried about their own safety and expressed dissatisfaction with the actions of law enforcement officers. It seemed that the investigation had reached a dead end. Considering all possible versions, the investigators did not rule out racist motives. After all, the victim was an Asian girl. All students of the appropriate origin were warned about the potential danger. Until the criminal was at large, none of them could feel safe. Society demanded that the police solve the murder and arrest the suspect as soon as possible. Michelle's grief-stricken mother arrived in Australia to meet with the relatives with whom her daughter lived until her death. The woman gave several interviews to the press in which she promised to make every effort to find the dangerous criminal. She was full of determination and put a lot of pressure on the police. From her, journalists learned that Michelle's grandmother could not withstand the news of her granddaughter's death and died of a heart attack. Thus, the killer took the lives of two family members at once. First of all, the investigators thoroughly checked the alibis of Michelle's closest circle. Her aunt had reliable confirmation that on the day of her niece's disappearance, she was on a business trip in a small town south of Sydney. This was evidenced by several witnesses, as well as tickets for transport and surveillance camera recordings. The woman herself was very hard going through the tragedy, blaming herself for not protecting Michelle. In her opinion, if she had not left home on that ill-fated day, then perhaps she could have prevented the disaster and saved her niece's life. The deceased's cousin, who lived with Michelle, her aunt, and his stepfather, also had an alibi. On the day of the girl's disappearance, he was engaged in everyday affairs, went to school, met with friends. Unlike Uncle Derek, the boy admitted that he did not see his sister on Thursday. Derek himself claimed that he spent the whole day at the computer. Being an IT specialist, the man supposedly worked hard on urgent projects that he had to complete by Monday. Michelle's cousin confirmed that his uncle really did not leave the computer then, but the boy could vouch for only about 3 hours spent with Derek in the apartment. Subsequently, the teenager made a shocking confession to the investigation. In general, neither Derek nor his stepson had a reliable alibi, so the police bombarded them with questions. After the first interrogation, Derek suddenly changed his testimony. It turned out that in fact, he left the house and met with some girl while his wife was away. This detail immediately attracted the attention of investigators. When asked why he did not tell about this immediately, the man referred to problems with drug addiction. Allegedly, due to the use of psychotropic substances, he has memory lapses, so he remembers the events of that day very vaguely. Such a confession sharply contrasted with the previous image of a decent family man that Derek was trying to create. And he could not provide the contacts of the girl with whom he allegedly met, so no one believed this version. Then Derek changed his testimony again. Now he stated that he was simply afraid to admit to cheating so as not to lose his wife if she found out about everything. This story seemed extremely dubious to the detectives. In addition, they noticed discrepancies in the testimony of Derek and his stepson. So the investigators' suspicions focused on the figure of Michelle's stepfather. To shed light on this dark story, the police decided to find out more about Derek Barrett and study the information from his mobile phone. By tracking the geolocation, law enforcement officers found that literally half an hour before the discovery of Michelle's body, the suspect's phone lit up 10 kilometers from Snapper Point. After reviewing the footage from surveillance cameras, investigators recorded how Derek refueled his car at a gas station near the crime scene. There, he also bought some drinks, paying with a bank card. The surveillance camera footage at the gas station clearly captured Derek Barrett, leaving no doubt about his presence in the area. So the detectives decided to ask what the suspect was doing so close to where Michelle's body was found shortly before its discovery. The man explained his presence at Snapper Point by visiting relatives. As it later turned out, Derek knew these places very well, as he was born and raised nearby. Moreover, a year ago, it was he who took Michelle to Snapper Point, where the girl even managed to take several photos against the backdrop of picturesque cliffs. However, such a coincidence seemed extremely dubious to the investigators. Although they understood that it would not be easy to prove Derek's involvement in the crime. However, intuition persistently suggested to the cops that it was worth digging deeper in the direction of Barrett. So they obtained permission for a more detailed study of the contents of his mobile phone, hoping to find at least some clues that would link the suspect with the victim. And their efforts were not in vain. Thanks to special programs, experts were able to restore a lot of deleted photos and videos that shocked seasoned police officers. In many frames, Michelle was completely naked and, it seems, did not even suspect that she was being filmed secretly. The girl carelessly slept or took a shower while Derek voyeuristically recorded her on camera. But the most chilling discovery were the clips in which the unfortunate Michelle lay on the bed tied up, with a gag in her mouth. Her gaze, full of despair and pleas for salvation, left no doubt. The girl became a victim of brutal violence against her will. This evidence from Derek's phone actually confirmed his guilt in the death of his niece. The collected materials were more than enough to consider Barrett not just the main suspect, but actually Michelle's killer. So on April 30th, Derek was arrested and taken into custody. However, the man immediately began to deny any involvement in the crime. The defendant's lawyer petitioned for his client's release on bail, but the defense's argument sounded unconvincing. Derek himself, through his attorney, expressed genuine surprise at the suspicions and arrest. Despite this, his wife, the aunt of the deceased Michelle, immediately filed for divorce. The woman was stunned by what had been happening within the walls of her house right under her nose. How could she have failed to notice all these warning signs earlier? She and her son immediately cut off all relations with Derek. Investigators determined that the photos of Michelle bound and gagged were taken on the day of her disappearance. Thus, the girl simply had no chance to tell anyone about the violence she had endured. Derek had personally documented his horrific crime against his defenseless niece. On his phone, earlier recordings were also found where he abused Michelle in a somewhat milder form. The girl probably did not realize the full danger, which is why she remained silent about her uncle's perversions. The collected evidence allowed investigators to reconstruct the picture of what happened on that fateful day of April 21st, 2016. When Michelle returned home, Derek snuck into her room and forcibly made her undress. Then he tied the girl up and gagged her. Recording all of this on camera, the pervert raped his victim. Soon after, Michelle's cousin, her aunt's son, returned home. The boy reported that for almost the entire time he was in the apartment, he did not see his stepfather but only heard some sounds. Apparently, water was constantly running in the shower, and Derek wasn't coming out for some reason. This seemed suspicious to the teenager, so he even became a bit worried. He approached the bathroom door and asked his stepfather if everything was all right. Hearing an affirmative response, the boy calmed down somewhat. Still, it was strange that Derek had been in the shower for almost 3 hours straight. During all this time, the man only opened the door once to ask his stepson to hand him some shampoo he had supposedly forgotten in the room. At the same time, Derek did not allow the boy to enter. Michelle's cousin sensed something was wrong but didn't dare to argue with his stepfather. At that moment, the teenager had no idea that he had narrowly missed witnessing the violence and that he could have saved his sister if he had insisted. The boy had no idea that Michelle was at home all this time. After all, judging by everything, she was tied up in her room upstairs. Shortly after her cousin left for a walk with friends, the unfortunate girl met her death at the hands of the perverted sadist. Derek managed to conceal the exact course of events and circumstances of the murder. The man claimed that due to drug use, he suffered from amnesia, so he simply didn't remember the details. It is only known that after the killing, Michelle's body ended up in the trunk of Derek's car. On April 23rd, the day after the murder, surveillance cameras on a neighboring house recorded the suspect taking out the trash from his home 4 times. Most likely, this was Derek's attempt to get rid of blood traces in the room. Then the man took the body to Sniper Point, the place where Michelle's mutilated remains were later discovered. Recordings from other surveillance cameras confirm that around 7 in the morning on April 24th, Derek's car entered the territory of Lake Manmora National Park. Just a few hours later, the girl's body was found by fishermen at the foot of the cliffs. The collected evidence was quite sufficient to prove Derek Barrett's guilt. The only chance for the defendant to avoid responsibility could have been declaring him insane. This is what the man's defense insisted on, using his claimed amnesia as an argument. However, the conclusions of the psychiatric examination were disappointing for Derek. The doctors did not find any deviations or disorders in him that could have affected his awareness of his own actions. This meant that the man was fully capable of standing trial and answering for his actions. So, after consulting with his lawyer, Derek Barrett decided to plead guilty to all charges, hoping to mitigate his sentence this way. During the trial, he tearfully apologized several times to those present, especially to his victim's mother. However, even in the dock, Derek continued to insist that drug problems had led to lapses in his memory. During the court hearing, Derek Barrett repeatedly stated that the events of that fateful day were forever etched in his memory, not allowing him to sleep peacefully at night. The man claimed that he was tormented by nightmares from which he would wake up in tears. The accused even expressed remorse for his actions, assuring that he sincerely regretted the consequences of his deeds. However, Derek continued to insist that on the day of the murder, he was under the strong influence of narcotics, which caused him to be unaware of his actions and unable to recall the details of what had happened. While in prison, he even wrote a letter to his victim's mother, May, in which he begged for forgiveness. In his message, Derek apologized 1,000 times for what he had done, assuring that he deeply regretted the crime committed. But despite all his pleas, the court found Barrett guilty of first-degree murder and a whole series of other serious crimes. The incredible cruelty and perverted nature of the sexual violence Michelle endured became aggravating circumstances in the sentencing. Consequently, Derek was sentenced to 46 years in prison. According to Australian law, he will have the right to apply for parole after serving 34 years of this term. However, the story of Michelle Leng's suffering did not end there. In 2019, a fateful event occurred that shed light on the full scale of abuse the 25-year-old student from China endured before her horrific death. It happened when Michelle's aunt came to visit her elderly mother, who lived in Strathfield, another Sydney suburb. The girl's grandmother suffered from dementia, so her daughter had to visit the sick woman often. During one of these visits, the elderly lady was tightly clutching a small object in her hands. When her daughter asked to see what she had, the woman handed her a USB flash drive. Michelle's mother wondered what it was and what information it contained. Unfortunately, the grandmother couldn't answer these questions. She thought she was holding some kind of toy, so Michelle's aunt took the flash drive with her. Upon arriving home, the woman decided out of curiosity to see what might be on it. She inserted the drive into her computer and froze in horror at seeing its contents. The aunt immediately contacted the police, handing over the terrible find to law enforcement. The flash drive contained 13 photographs and 9 videos, with a total duration of over an hour. All these materials vividly demonstrated the horrific scale of abuse that poor Michelle endured in the last hours of her life. The video showed Derek bursting into the girl's room, brutally tossing her around like a rag doll, after which he repeatedly raped her. Michelle's screams and pleas to stop the abuse seemed only to fuel her executioner's sadistic inclinations. Derek's face was frozen in a mask of perverted pleasure, and it didn't look at all like the man was under the influence of drugs, as he tried to prove in court. No, it seemed he was simply reveling in his power over the defenseless victim and deriving sick satisfaction from the very process of violence. But it still remains a mystery how the flash drive with these horrifying video evidence ended up with Michelle's grandmother. The old woman had no connection to either Derek or his victim. She lived quite far from Campsie, and she couldn't explain the origin of the USB drive herself due to progressive dementia. Eventually, the court was forced to review the charges against Derek Barrett in light of the newly discovered circumstances. He was charged with 9 additional counts related to sex crimes. This increased his prison term by 20 years, to 66, and the period after which Barrett can apply for parole increased to 36.5 years. The relatives of the deceased girl insisted that her killer should be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In their opinion, the terrible cruelty and perverted nature of the crime against poor Michelle could not have any other verdict. The judge took into account the appeal of the victim's loved ones, but noted that from a legal standpoint, life imprisonment was not possible in this case. So Derek Barrett will have the right to file his first petition for parole no earlier than 2052. But even this term seems too merciful, given the suffering that Michelle and her loved ones endured at his hands. After all, the girl came from her home to distant Australia not to become prey to a pervert who turned out to be a real wolf in sheep's clothing. Michelle was simply trying to help her mother and ease the financial burden on her family by agreeing to live with relatives and save on rent. The unfortunate victim silently endured abuse for 4 long years, hoping that one day it would finally stop. Unfortunately, instead of rescue, she was met with a tragic and premature death at the hands of her sadistic uncle. The tragic story of Michelle Leng is a bitter lesson for all of us. It reminds us how important it is to be vigilant and careful, even when it seems there is no danger. For sometimes evil hides where we least expect to see it. First and foremost, this story underscores the importance of open dialogue in the family. If Michelle had felt she could safely tell someone about what was happening, perhaps the tragedy could have been avoided. So creating an atmosphere of trust and mutual understanding between loved ones is the first step to preventing such situations. Also, this terrible story teaches us not to ignore warning signs. Perhaps if Michelle's relatives had been more attentive to changes in her behavior, they could have raised the alarm in time. So if you notice that something incomprehensible is happening with your loved ones, don't be afraid to reveal it and offer your help. Women and girls should be especially careful. Unfortunately, they most often become victims of domestic violence and perverted encroachments. So it's so important not to be silent, not to be ashamed, and not to endure abuse. If you feel something is wrong, immediately seek protection from relatives or contact law enforcement. Let Michelle's death not be in vain. Let's make her story a warning to all of us. Let's be more sensitive to our loved ones, more attentive to alarming bells, and always ready to come to the aid of those who need it. A young Italian woman, Veronica Panarello, faced numerous challenges in her life. At the age of 16, she met Davide Stival at a bar, who immediately caught her eye, and she quickly opened up to him. Despite the 4-year age difference, the couple conversed as if they had known each other for a long time. Despite the girl's youth, they started a relationship. Within 3 months, Veronica was already begging to start a family. The girl had no doubts. She wanted a child from David. He agreed and they moved in together. Soon, Veronica became pregnant. In 2006, when she was only 17 and he was 21, their son Loris was born. It was then that Veronica's family began to experience problems. Constant conflicts with her parents and the desire to run away from home intensified with the birth of the out-of-wedlock child. However, the young girl created a semblance of a family, contrary to the expectations of her elders. To the surprise of their relatives, the young couple's affairs were going quite well. Terrible trials lay ahead, but for now, Veronica tried to give her son everything he needed. Over time, the couple officially legalized their marriage. The young mother became pregnant again and gave birth to a second boy, whom they named Diego. Veronica essentially remained under the care of her parents. Although Davide worked, his efforts were not enough to provide for his wife and 2 children. The parents from both sides supported the couple in every possible way, primarily financially. Veronica, on the other hand, did not even think about looking for a job, having completely devoted herself to the children and the household. Her husband considered her an exemplary, industrious, neat, and loving wife. The children grew up, having genuinely warm relationships with their mother. She spent all her free time with them, although sometimes it resembled more of a friendship between peers. Probably because of the too early age of motherhood, There is an opinion that Veronica was still in a rebellious mood, which is why conflicts with her parents escalated. The elders believed that she would not become a full-fledged mother if she perceived everything as a game. But any attempts to get through to her ended in hysterics. The couple lived in a rural area with a population of 10,000 inhabitants, the town of Santa Croce Camarina in southern Italian Sicily, where everyone knew each other. For such a cozy corner, such early motherhood seemed strange. However, no one suspected that this reckless youthful haste would lead to the terrible tragedy that we will tell you about. On November 29, 2014, at noon, Veronica Panarello appeared at the police station. The 25-year-old woman reported the disappearance of her 8-year-old son Loris. According to her, in the morning, as always, she had brought the boy to school. He went inside with the other students. Then she took her younger son to kindergarten. Loris was supposed to be at school until 12:30. When the woman came to pick him up, her son was nowhere to be found. The mother became alarmed and could not find him. Immediately after that, Veronica decided to go to the police and write a statement about the disappearance of the 8-year-old boy. Law enforcement officers immediately contacted the school, but no teacher or employee had seen Loris that day. The students also confirmed that they had not met him either near the school or in class. Some thought that the boy was skipping classes. Others assumed that he could have been kidnapped. However, no one believed that Loris would voluntarily get into an unfamiliar car. He was too smart for that. So the question arose, how could he have ended up on the street if his mother had taken him to the school door and saw him go inside? At that time, her 29-year-old husband Davide Stival was working as a driver and was on a trip in Rome. The Carabinieri immediately called him, and the man was shocked by the news. It turned out that his wife had not even informed him. Then he called Veronica himself, and she confirmed Loris's disappearance. David immediately got on a plane to get to the city as quickly as possible. As soon as he landed, he saw a post on his wife's social media with a photo of her and their son. It was an announcement that the boy had been found dead. Loris's body was found 4 hours after the police report. It had been thrown into a ditch near an old mill. The place was just minutes away from the couple's house by car. It was accidentally discovered by an elderly man who was hunting in the area. During his usual walk through the forest, he noticed something suspicious in the mud. As he approached, the witness realized that it was not just a discarded object, but the body of a child. The man immediately informed the police about the discovery. At the scene, criminologists found the child's mutilated body, unnaturally twisted in the ditch, with his pants pulled down and no underwear. Law enforcement officers immediately suspected a sexual motive for the crime. Investigators believed that they were dealing with a child molester. However, unlike typical perverts, he not only raped his victims, but also killed them. This made the criminal twice as dangerous. News of the tragedy quickly spread through the town, sowing panic among the inhabitants. The realization that every child could become a target of a predator instilled fear and forced people to change their usual way of life. The news of the murder in the small village instantly flew around all of Italy. The country's central TV channels talked about the victim. This event became one of the loudest newsworthy events of 2014, stirring up the public. Society demanded that the police catch the criminal as soon as possible and bring him to justice. Meanwhile, detectives, working tirelessly, searched for the monster capable of such an act to calm the community. The investigators working on the case immediately noticed some strange details. The crime was clearly not committed according to the classic scheme characteristic of typical rapists and maniacs. The strangest thing was not even the absence of the child's underwear. After removing it, the criminal put the pants back on the body. Such abusers do indeed often collect the victim's belongings, but they almost never put the clothes back on after taking the trophy. Moreover, no similar cases had been observed in this area before. The police turned their attention to the family of the deceased. Veronica and Davide were decent people. Everyone knew them as a loving young family. Despite the fact that the child was born when the mother was a minor, now she had become an adult woman and really gave the impression of a devoted mother. In any case, under such circumstances, the most valuable information can be provided by the family itself, so the investigators came to talk to the parents of the murdered boy. Here, the police found out that Davide spent very little time at home. Due to his work as a driver, he was with his family for no more than 50 days a month. Almost all the free time, the children were with their mother. Thus, the young woman was constantly left alone, without a husband. It was not easy for her to cope with household chores and raising children on her own. The woman often complained about the difficulties. Against the background of her loneliness, rumors about lovers spread through the town. However, during the check, it was not possible to confirm this information. At the Stiefel family's house, the police found Veronica. According to Davide, this tragedy had destroyed her. The young mother was constantly crying and refusing to eat. Subsequently, this led to exhaustion. The young woman was taken to the hospital, where she had to be given special IV drips with a nutritious solution so that she would not die. The police saw her during this period. She really looked bad. Veronica was emotionally broken. It even manifested physically. Huge dark circles formed under her eyes and her skin took on an unhealthy pallor. During this period, Loris's younger brother Diego was still living with the family. However, later, the parents took him to his grandparents, as the mother was in an unstable mental state. She did not take care not only of herself, but also ignored the needs of the child. The husband supported his wife all this time and was forced to quit his job. Despite the difficulty with which the Stiefel family was experiencing the loss of a child, the investigators decided to bring both parents to the place where Loris's body was found. The police made video recordings. They believed that this trip could provide useful data. In the video, you can see not even Veronica, but literally the shadow of a person. So hard was she experiencing the loss of her son. Horatio Fedone got on the list of suspects. He was the same elderly hunter who discovered the child's body. The detectives suspected him because the man had led them to the victim, just 4 hours after the boy was declared missing. Of course, it could have been a coincidence, but it was worth making sure how the man managed to find the deceased so quickly. The investigators launched a large-scale check but could not find a connection between the hunter and the evidence. He successfully passed a polygraph test, had a confirmed alibi for the morning of Loris's disappearance, and his fingerprints and DNA were not found on the boy's body. However, the heightened interest in Horatio Fedone led to local residents starting to accuse Veronica of having an intimate relationship with his grandson and even with him. In the end, after rather harsh checks, all suspicions were removed from Horatio. The detectives were convinced that Horatio had indeed accidentally stumbled upon the boy. He had the misfortune to be in that place just a few hours after Loris was declared missing. At the same time, the investigation ran out of assumptions and leads. No traces indicating the perpetrator could be found, so it was decided to call in reinforcements of Carabinieri from Rome to join the investigation. The new participants in the case, having studied all the materials, believed that the mother was involved in the disappearance of her son. They immediately drew attention to the problems in the relationship between Veronica and her relatives. The grandparents told the investigators that the deceased boy had told them about a strange experiment at school. According to the child, his mother had bought plastic zip ties needed for classes. The boy talked about this literally the day before his disappearance. This seemed suspicious because zip ties are quite a dangerous object and are prohibited from being used in school. When the detectives asked the teachers about this experiment, it turned out that they really had not planned anything like that and would not have needed any cable ties. Eventually, the investigators decided that the child had made them up. But after receiving the report from the forensic experts, the investigators remembered these items. According to the specialists who performed the autopsy, the time of the child's death fell between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning on the day he disappeared. The cause of the boy's death was strangulation by some foreign object of small thickness, tightened around his neck. It looks very much like he was strangled with cable ties. Then the investigators suggested that there might be a connection between these two facts. The forensic expert believed that the murder was committed somewhere near the place where the body was found, since the injuries from the fall were received almost immediately after death, or he was thrown out while still alive and died a little later. The detectives assumed that the child could really, for some reason, have wanted to get these ties and made up a story about their need at school. Then Loris would have had to carry them in his backpack when he went to class. But how could the attacker have known about this? It raised great doubts that the killer attacked the boy, grabbed his backpack, and began to look for a murder weapon there. The Carabinieri considered it necessary to find the blue backpack, believing that it would give new clues. To do this, they blocked all the landfills where waste was brought from Santa Croce Camarina. In the end, it took the police several days to examine the dumps, but they never managed to find the boy's blue backpack. In addition to information about strangulation, the forensic medical examination made it possible to find out another strange circumstance. Despite the absence of underwear and the lowered pants, no signs of sexual violence or traces of the DNA of the probable pervert were found. From that moment on, the police had doubts about the previous version of events. They were still looking for the criminal, but already understood that this was not a typical maniac or molester. It no longer seemed that the crime was committed on sexual grounds. It was necessary to compile a full psychological profile of the killer. However, at this stage of the investigation, the information turned out to be too confusing, and it was problematic to do this. The solution suggested itself. The detectives decided to trace the path that the mother and child were moving on the day of the massacre. Despite the fact that it was a very small provincial town, Veronica and Loris were moving along the central street, where many houses had surveillance cameras installed. Of course, it took a lot of time to collect and view the recordings. It is clear that law enforcement officers tried to notice a third person following a woman with her son in a black Volkswagen Polo. Perhaps a suspicious car was following them. However, no matter how hard the investigators tried, they could not notice anything unusual that would be of interest to them. However, quite quickly, the detectives drew attention to several strange things. Firstly, they never managed to see the moment when the boy enters the school, although the mother continued to insist that she allegedly took him almost to the threshold of the educational institution. It became clear that Veronica was lying, and they did not reach the school that morning. After viewing dozens of hours of recordings, the investigators saw that only the younger child got out of the car near the kindergarten. The detectives continued to analyze the camera recordings from the entire district in search of clues. So they saw how at one of the intersections that Veronica was supposed to pass, she turned towards the church, not far from which the victim was later found. This seemed strange because for many years before that, she had used a different road. What could have forced the young mother to change her preferences on the very day when her son was found dead? This aroused certain suspicions among the Carabinieri. At this stage, the police officers decided not to disclose the discovered information so as not to startle Veronica, but began to consider the young woman as a suspect. Experienced policemen decided to immediately check the veracity of her words. To do this, Veronica was asked to drive with the investigators along the same route that she used on the day of the child's death so that she could show everything personally. They already knew the route as they had managed to completely restore it with the help of recordings from video surveillance cameras. The woman agreed, and they began to conduct a reconstruction of events. When the police car, together with Veronica, drove up to that decisive intersection where she changed her preferences, the woman lied. The detectives investigating the murder of 8-year-old Loris Stivel began to suspect his mother, Veronica Panarello, after discovering that she had lied about her route on the morning her son disappeared. During the investigative experiment, the woman indicated that she was moving along the usual path, although the surveillance camera recordings showed otherwise. The police decided to search the Stivel family's house and interrogate Veronica at the station. The young mother was outraged to learn that she was considered a likely killer of her own child. She insisted on her innocence, stating that under no circumstances would she have harmed her son. However, the investigators had reason to think otherwise. During the hours-long interrogation, Veronica admitted that she had dropped off her elder son Loris half a kilometer from the school that morning because she was in a hurry. According to her, someone could have attacked the boy on the way. The woman also denied being near the ravines where her son's body was found, assuring that she was not at all familiar with that area. However, the suspect's sister refuted these statements, saying that in childhood they often visited there and knew those places well. Veronica's presence in the crime area was also confirmed by surveillance camera recordings. David Stival, the father of the deceased boy, at first could not believe in his wife's involvement in the murder of their son. After viewing the video recordings, he recognized Veronica and the children, who left the house in the morning. But instead of taking Loris to school, the woman turned him back home. He was no longer visible on the recordings. Then Veronica took the younger child to the kindergarten and returned. Contrary to her habit, she drove into the garage in reverse rather than leaving the car in front of the house. According to the investigators, it was at this time between 9 and 10 in the morning that the crime occurred. Loris was not at school and stayed at home, and when his mother drove into the garage, she was doing something out of the camera's view. Despite all the evidence, Veronica continued to deny her guilt, insisting that she had taken her elder son to school and her younger son to kindergarten, after which she returned home. She suggested that Loris could have been kidnapped right outside the school, but the police did not believe this because they saw on the video how at 9:23 Veronica left the house again, and just 2 minutes later she was heading towards the old mill, where her son's body was soon found. Returning home at 9:38, she was definitely alone. Given the speed of events, the boy most likely was no longer breathing when he was thrown into the ditch. At 9:41, Veronica was already on her way to her usual cooking classes. She left early to arrive by the start of classes at 10 in the morning and not arouse suspicion. There, no one noticed any changes in her behavior. GPS data from Veronica's phone and car confirmed her movements established by the investigators. Unfortunately, the collected evidence was not yet sufficient for an official accusation, so the young mother was simply placed under arrest, and law enforcement officers continued to search for irrefutable evidence. At some point, it seemed that the suspect was about to be exposed, but suddenly, a policewoman who was on duty near the school turned to the station. She claimed that she had seen Veronica dropping Loris off at the educational institution on the day of the murder. However, the investigators did not trust these statements too much because they contradicted the video recordings. The policewoman could have simply confused the days since Veronica performed the same actions every morning. Meanwhile, the main suspect was behind bars, desperately proving her innocence. But the seeds of doubt had already been sown. When the carabinieri told David about the discrepancies in his wife's route, he also acknowledged her behavior as suspicious and sided with the investigation. The police saw this as an opportune moment to obtain a confession. They understood that the suspect most likely trusted her husband, so they decided to arrange a meeting between them, during which Davide would try to elicit some new details from his wife. After all, Veronica was the only person who had complete information about the events of that tragic morning. David agreed that it was a good idea, but noted that he did not seek his wife's conviction. 1 month after the brutal murder of 8-year-old Loris Stival, on January 6, 2015, his father David came to meet with his arrested wife Veronica. Despite the fact that according to Italian law he had no right to be in prison, the police made an exception, hoping that it would help solve the crime. Veronica didn't even greet her husband, but immediately asked if he had a microphone for eavesdropping. Davide denied it and proved the absence of any recording devices. In fact, they were not needed because the meeting was being filmed by a prison surveillance camera. The suspect continued to insist on her innocence and version of events. She incessantly repeated to everyone, the police, the lawyer, her husband, relatives who visited her in prison, that she had taken her son to school and did not know what had happened to him next. The detectives could not prove the mother's involvement in the massacre. Even the motive itself raised doubts. Everyone who knew Veronica characterized her as a decent woman who sincerely loved her sons. Of course, there were various rumors, but the investigators checked every word and found no confirmation of the gossip. Veronica was indeed a caring mother. The only lead that seemed plausible to the detectives to explain the crime could be depression or emotional instability. The main suspect was indeed in a very depressed state, which only worsened due to her imprisonment. The investigation had reached a dead end, and it occurred to the investigators to allow the mother to visit the child's grave to say goodbye to him. Veronica was taken to the cemetery, accompanied by a whole motorcade of 10 cars with flashing lights on. It seemed as if a dangerous maniac was being transported through the city. A listening device was installed on the tombstone, of course. The officers were sure that by leaving the mother alone with her deceased son, they would hear an apology or a confession of murder. And Veronica started talking. But these were not at all the words that the police expected to hear. She was sobbing, praying, and swearing that she knew her boy's killer and would punish him. This came as a complete surprise to the Carabinieri. Later, she was put in a car to be taken back to her cell. On the way, the young mother suddenly reported that at her son's grave she had some kind of insight. She admitted that she had begun to recall the events of that fatal day, which had previously eluded her memory. However, Veronica was not going to share this with the detectives. Instead, she expressed a desire to meet with her husband again. On November 6, 2015, David visited Veronica again. Of course, like all visits behind prison walls, this meeting was also recorded. This time, the main suspect admitted for the first time that she thought she had not taken the child to school at all on the day of his disappearance. The woman complained about difficulties in expressing her thoughts, as she found herself in an unusual state. According to Veronica, that morning she seemed to have fallen out of reality, and everything around her seemed shrouded in fog. From her fragmentary memories, she was able to recreate how she took her younger son to kindergarten and then returned home, where Loris was supposed to be. She left her elder son at home because he did not want to go to school. But when she returned, Veronica did not find the boy. Being in a strange state, she thought that she had already taken him to school, but realized her mistake when she came to pick up the child from school, and he was not there. The police, of course, did not believe the new version, but were convinced that they were moving in the right direction. It almost resembled the very confession they had needed for a whole year to bring the killer to justice. They considered her excuse of memory loss an attempt to mitigate her guilt and get a shorter sentence than she deserved. However, not everyone shared this point of view, since the woman's condition really caused concern. Unfortunately, the younger son was still too young and could not testify to the police about whether he had seen his brother that day. Despite their confidence in Veronica's involvement in the murder, the Carabinieri decided to meet her halfway and suggested going home in the hope that it would help unlock new memories. She was led through the rooms, which remained unchanged from the day of the boy's death. When the main suspect entered Loris's room, something theatrical began to happen. She started speaking in her son's voice and reproducing the dialogues that she allegedly had with him that morning. The detectives saw how emotionlessly she was doing it, and at that moment they became convinced that before them was a true pathological liar and manipulator who was once again trying to lead the investigation away from the truth. But could she, being in her right mind, have been deceiving everyone for more than a year? During this time, dozens of specialists had spoken with the suspect. Despite the fact that the police officers were not sure about the reliability of the new version of events told by the young mother, many still believe in it to this day. According to Veronica, after returning home from the kindergarten, she started washing baby bottles. Her elder son Loris did not want to go to school, so the woman allowed him to spend the whole day at home. While the mother was doing household chores, the boy was in his room. Veronica did not hear anything suspicious, but when she entered her son's room sometime later, she saw his blue body with cable ties tightened around his neck. The child had probably been playing with them and tried to tighten them around his neck. The ties were connected to each other like a necklace. As the woman recounted, her son froze with frightened eyes. He was pulling on one of the ends of the ties, thinking that this way he would be able to open them, but in fact, he was only tightening the deadly trap even more. The mother knew how they worked, but realized that she would not be able to tear them apart with her hands, so she ran to the kitchen for scissors. When the story's heroine returned and cut the fatal ribbon, the boy was no longer showing signs of life. He had lost consciousness and was not breathing. According to Veronica's confession, she had a panic attack. She immediately took her cell phone and tried to dial the emergency service number. However, she was shaking so much that she simply could not dial the number. Her fingers were missing the buttons, and the numbers were blurring before her eyes. After all this, Veronica realized that she would be the one blamed for what had happened. Being in an inadequate state, she decided to get rid of her son's body. Later, the forensic medical examination confirmed the presence of scratches on the child's face and neck. They resembled real attempts to tear off the cable ties from him with fingernails. Unfortunately, the ties had cut too deep into the skin, so it was impossible to tear them off with hands. According to the investigators, in a panic, the mother could have pulled on one of the ends of the ties herself, which further aggravated the situation and finally cut off the access to oxygen. At this stage, the police decided to clarify the information and, if possible, awaken new memories, so Veronica and Davide were again taken to the place where Loris was found. Here, the mother admitted that she had indeed thrown the child into the ravine, but continued to deny that she had dealt with him herself. She still could not explain why the boy had no underwear. This circumstance did not fit into her story in any way. It also raised great doubts as to why an 8-year-old intelligent child would put these ties around his neck, tighten them more and more, and not even call for help. Later, the suspect recalled that the ravine turned out to be too deep, so the pants accidentally slipped off the body, and it twisted as the boy rolled to the bottom. At the trial, the prosecution tried to refute the mother's confession. Her uncharacteristic behavior was the most alarming. Veronica parked the car in the garage in a very unusual way, so that it was really convenient to load the body unnoticed. However, this happened at a moment when she could not yet have known about her son's death. According to her confession, he died later. In the opinion of the prosecution, this indicated the intentional nature of the murder. The defense continued to insist that the mother did not kill the child, but that he himself died due to negligence. Realizing the severity of what had happened, Veronica simply got scared. The woman was in a state of shock, so she took the body out and threw it away. However, she could not answer one of the key questions. The prosecution could not understand why she took the underwear off the boy and then put his pants back on. According to Veronica, she simply did not remember this. The prosecutor considered her actions an attempt to stage an attack on the boy by a rapist in order to lead the investigation along the wrong path. Initially, her plan worked, and the police were looking for such a criminal, but later they realized that it was part of the staging. During the trial of this case, an unexpected plot twist emerged. Veronica admitted that Loris was killed by the boy's grandfather on his father's side, named Andrea Stiefel. She allegedly had an affair with her husband's father. That day, the child caught them having sex and began to threaten that he would tell his father everything. Andrea Stiefel, the boy's paternal grandfather, allegedly attacked his grandson in a fit of anger and strangled him. Despite this strange turn of events, law enforcement officers were forced to check the accused's statement. They turned to the surveillance camera recordings again. Thus, the investigators found out that none of the men had entered the house that morning. However, in the footage where Veronica was leaving the house around 9:30, a dark silhouette was indeed visible in the back seat of the car. The Carabinieri were forced to involve specialists for the analysis of the video recordings, but they claimed that it was not the shadow of a person, but glare on the car windows. Andrea Stiefel himself denied both the connection with his son's wife and the murder of his grandson. He stated that this was another lie of a crazy woman. The grandfather had a confirmed alibi. In addition, there was no correspondence or even calls between the so-called lovers, which also refuted Veronica's words. Therefore, no one believed this new version of the defendant. Veronica's behavior suggested that the investigation was dealing with a person with mental disorders. Her strange behavior was emphasized by all the officers and specialists who communicated with her. One of the detectives recalled that during one of the interrogations, the woman suddenly began to sing, and also repeatedly her calm and loud speech changed to an indistinct mumbling under her breath with a blank look. Veronica seemed to periodically fall out of reality and could start smoking an imaginary cigarette. The defendant's mother said that Veronica had previously had mental problems. From an early age, she was repeatedly sexually abused by boys. At the age of 14, the girl tried to take her own life by drinking bleach after a quarrel with her school friends. The following year, she tried to hang herself in a greenhouse. Veronica underwent treatment in a psychiatric clinic. Once she called her mother and asked her to pick her up because the paramedic had allegedly raped her. But these accusations did not receive any confirmation, and no one believed the girl. A psychiatric examination showed that Veronica acted in a cold-blooded, prudent, and cruel manner. No serious mental disorders were found in her that would allow her to be declared insane. The trial lasted a whole 4 years due to constant postponements and additional investigations. Based on the results of the trial, she was found guilty of premeditated murder and concealment of the body. The judge sentenced her to 30 years in prison. After that, another performance took place. Obviously, the child's grandfather, whom Veronica referred to as the criminal, was in the courtroom. The defendant did not agree with the verdict, so she stood up and again began to accuse the man of all those absurd things that she had already voiced earlier in court. She was removed from the courtroom and sent behind bars. Veronica is still in prison, keeping the terrible truth of the death of the 8-year-old boy, which we will probably never know. However, most of the investigators who worked on this case believe that it was not an accident, but a planned, brutal murder. Probably, on that day, the son did not want to go to school. This had happened before. It was not the first case of him skipping. On this basis, the mother quarreled with her son and strangled him with ties in a fit of anger, and then got rid of the body, deliberately removed his underwear to confuse the investigation. But since the ties were purchased in advance, perhaps it all looked even more ominous and indicated the planning of the murder. The boy's father stated after the trial that his life was destroyed because he had simultaneously lost his son, wife, and job. The man is still not sure that it was Veronica who killed the boy. He did not understand what could have been the reason for killing his son. David had never seen his wife display violence towards the children. She had always been a caring mother. Now he is trying to live for the sake of his younger son, in whose upbringing his parents are helping him. The story of Veronica Panarello and her son Loris is a tragic tale of how impulsive decisions, lack of maturity, and emotional instability can lead to devastating consequences. This case serves as a cautionary tale for all parents about the importance of responsible parenting and the need to overcome one's own psychological issues for the safety and well-being of their family. The main cause of this tragedy was Veronica's inability to cope with the challenges of motherhood at such a young age. Her emotional immaturity, possible mental disorders, and lack of proper support from loved ones created a dangerous combination of factors that ultimately led to the child's death. To prevent such tragedies, it is crucial that young parents have access to the resources and support necessary for raising children. This includes parenting education, emotional support, counseling, and assistance in case of psychological issues. Society as a whole should pay more attention to the mental health and well-being of families, especially those facing additional challenges such as early and unplanned pregnancies. We must all learn from this story and work towards creating a more compassionate and supportive environment for parents and children. Only then can we prevent such tragedies and ensure that every child has the opportunity to grow up in a safe and loving environment. Dear viewers, thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope this story has made you think and that you have learned valuable lessons from it. Remember that you are not alone in your struggles and that you can always seek help. If you enjoyed this content, please like, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to watch my other videos. I am truly grateful for your support and attention. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones. Until next time.